Section 1. The architecture of a live Vault-Tec and Project Safe House. There is something almost comforting about the idea of a vault. A sealed door, thick concrete walls stretching down into bedrock, the steady hum of air recyclers keeping the world at bay. Somewhere beneath all that noise and heat and radiation, people survive. They breathe recycled air. They eat rations and read old books and raise children who will never know the sound of wind through actual trees, or the smell of rain on warm pavement, or the specific blue of an afternoon sky in October. That is the dream Vault-Tec sold. And somewhere between the glossy brochures and the cheery yellow and blue jumpsuit aesthetic, buried under the smiling cartoon mascots and the optimistic promises of preservation, something else was being built. Something quieter, something that would not become fully visible until the doors were unsealed and the survivors stumbled out into a wasteland they had never been allowed to prepare for. What those survivors found, in most cases, was the evidence of what had actually been done to them. This is about those stories, not the fast version, the slow one, the kind you can sink into and let carry you somewhere dim and still, where the distance between you and the outside world stretches out as wide as a 200-year silence. So settle in, get comfortable, let the weight of all that concrete feel less like a cage and more like a blanket. We are going into the vaults. To understand what Vault-Tec was doing, you have to first understand what Vault-Tec was saying. The public face of the corporation was remarkably warm. The advertisements broadcast over pre-war American radio and television were cheerful, almost to the point of parody. Mascots grinned from billboards. Robotic voices explained the specifications of underground shelters with the same casual confidence of a salesman describing a kitchen appliance. Vault-Tec promised safety, it promised community, it promised that, in the event of the worst thing imaginable, Americans would be looked after. And the worst thing imaginable was looking increasingly likely. The resource wars of the 21st century had been grinding the world down for decades by the time Vault-Tec's advertisements began in earnest. Oil was running critically short. Tensions between the United States and China had calcified into something that stopped short of open warfare only by technicality and diplomatic inertia. In Europe, the fighting had already started, the old continent tearing itself apart over remaining petroleum reserves with the kind of quiet desperation that gets coded in careful diplomatic language, until suddenly it cannot be coded anymore. The United Nations dissolved in 2052, which was less a political event and more the official acknowledgement that the architecture of international cooperation had already fallen apart. In the United States, there was a particular flavor of anxiety that had worked its way into everyday life. Not quite panic, not quite acceptance. Something in between the kind of low-frequency dread that makes people respond to vault advertisements with genuine interest rather than the dismissive laughter such a pitch might have earned in calmer decades. People were afraid. They were trying to make plans that accounted for very bad outcomes. Vault-Tec gave them a plan. The corporation moved into that atmosphere the way all great confidence operations move at exactly the right moment, with exactly the right message. The official program was called Project Safe House. Construction on the first proof-of-concept facility broke ground in 2054, deep beneath the city of Los Angeles. Over the following years, the project expanded significantly. New vaults were commissioned, designed, and constructed across the continental United States. 122 facilities in total, each one a sealed underground community capable of sustaining a fixed population for decades or longer, depending on its specific parameters. The government sanctioned it. The public largely welcomed it. Entry into the vaults was competitive, a kind of desperate lottery that families signed up for and hoped to win when the time came. Some vaults were reserved for specific populations: military families, government workers, particular professions that the program's designers considered valuable. Some were sold to the general public through a bidding process that predictably favored the wealthy. And when the time came on October 23, 2077, when the warheads finally fell, the doors did close. The people who had secured their spots descended into the concrete. The familiar faces of their neighbors and co-workers and, in some cases, strangers they had never seen before, crowded into reception areas lit by the steady institutional glow of fluorescent lighting. The enormous steel doors groaned shut behind them. The ground shook, or it did not, for those far enough from the nearest strike. The world above began dying in a way that would take years to fully complete. Most of the residents had no idea that the door closing was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of the experiment. The truth of what Vault-Tec was doing existed in two layers, each one darker than the last. The first layer is the one that becomes visible when you look at what each vault was actually designed to do, as opposed to what the residents were told. Out of 122 facilities built, only a small fraction were what they appeared to be on the surface, genuine attempts to preserve human life and community in the event of catastrophe. These are sometimes called control vaults in the lore, though even that designation is complicated because the distinction between a control and an experimental facility assumes a standard against which the others are being measured. The other facilities had secondary purposes, hidden instructions, secret parameters that activated the moment the doors sealed, and the overseers received their full briefing packets. These purposes ranged from the psychologically cruel to the biologically nightmarish to the philosophically baffling. Some vaults were designed to observe how people responded to specific social pressures and resource allocation conflicts. Some were medical and genetic laboratories. Some were built to fail in specific ways, testing what happened when essential systems degraded or authority collapsed or trust eroded past recovery. In Vault 11, the experiment was a manufactured social contract built around annual human sacrifice. In Vault 92, it was acoustic manipulation designed to produce latent combat behavior in an unsuspecting population of musicians. In Vault 75, it was the systematic exploitation of children who were raised to believe they were training to be heroes. The residents of these facilities, real people, real families, musicians and scientists and ordinary workers who had believed they were being saved, became unwitting subjects in one of the most sustained programs of human experimentation ever conducted. They signed their consent forms and descended through the doors, and became data points in a program whose architects never intended to inform them of its true nature. The second, deeper layer is about who was actually behind it. The Enclave. That organization, a deep state network of the highest-ranking military, political, and corporate figures in pre-war America, had its fingerprints across Vault-Tec's entire operation. The Enclave viewed itself as the true inheritor of the United States government, not the America that existed in 2077, crumbling under the weight of its own contradictions, but the America that could be rebuilt from the rubble afterward. A purified version. A version whose composition would be determined by people who had survived not by luck but by design, selected and prepared and positioned to exercise authority over whatever emerged from the chaos. For that plan to work, the war had to happen, and the survivors who emerged from it had to be the right kind of survivors. The Vault experiments were, in part, a method of determining what that meant: behavioral data, genetic data, psychological resilience data, decades of sealed observation that the Enclave could theoretically monitor from its offshore facilities, drawing conclusions about what human populations could endure, what forms of authority they would accept, how they could be shaped and controlled and redirected. One of Fallout's original designers, Tim Kaine, has spoken about a grand design underlying the vaults, the possibility that they were intended, at some level, as dry runs for generation ship technology. A vessel capable of sustaining human life across centuries in a sealed environment, carrying humanity to the stars if the Earth became truly uninhabitable. Whether that specific ambition persisted consistently through the game series is a matter of interpretation. But the staggering, centuries-spanning arrogance of the underlying plan, treating millions of people as experimental subjects in a project they were never asked to consent to, runs through every Vault story the games have told. The Fallout television series added one more wrinkle to this history that is worth noting: the suggestion, communicated through the recovered memories of Vault-Tec's leadership, that the corporation did not merely anticipate the nuclear exchange but actively worked to ensure it would happen. That the war itself was manufactured, not by external forces that could not be stopped but by internal ones that chose not to stop it, because the aftermath of the war was more useful to their plans than any alternative that peace might have produced. If that is true, and the series presents it as true, at least within its version of the timeline, then every story that follows carries a different weight. Not the tragedy of things that went wrong and could not be prevented, but the deliberate architecture of things that were engineered to go exactly as they did. Before we go to the individual vaults, one thing worth understanding is the role of the Overseer. Every vault had one. The Overseer was the designated leader, the administrative authority, the person responsible for maintaining order and implementing whatever experimental parameters the facility had been assigned. In Vault-Tec's public presentation, The overseer was a reassuring figure, experienced, stable, selected for their judgment and their ability to guide a community through long decades of isolation. In reality, the overseers occupied one of the most morally complex positions in the entire program. Some had been fully briefed before the doors sealed. They knew the experiment. They had agreed to implement it. They descended into the vault understanding that their role was not simply to preserve their community, but to subject it to specific conditions, specific stressors, specific manufactured pressures, designed to produce data. Some were given partial information enough to execute the experiment's mechanics without necessarily understanding the full scope of what they were participating in. Some appeared to have received their real instructions sealed, to be opened only after the doors closed, when escape was no longer an option, and the choice between compliance and refusal had consequences that were entirely internal. And some resisted. Some overseers found ways to protect their residents from the worst elements of the program, to manipulate the experimental parameters in ways that reduced harm, to use their authority to serve the people in their charge rather than the program that had given them that authority. These overseers are, generally, not the famous ones. Their stories are quieter, their resistance left fewer marks. The overseers who became monsters who used their unchecked authority to extend and intensify the experiments beyond even what the program had designed are far better documented. When you are the only law in a sealed facility 200 feet underground, with no external oversight and no mechanism for accountability, the question of what you become over time is answered differently by different people. The Vault experiment, whatever else it was studying, produced a very large amount of data on that specific question. If you are finding this comfortable, the low pace of it, the slow accumulation of detail, the particular quality of quiet that comes with going very deep into things that happened a long time ago, drop a comment. Tell me where you are in the world, what time it is there, whether it is raining, and if you are new here, consider subscribing. There is more. There is always more. Now, the Sacrifice Vault. Section 2. Vault 11. The lottery that ran for 75 years. There is a short story by Shirley Jackson called The Lottery that has troubled readers since its publication in 1948. It describes an annual ritual in a small American town, cheerful, ordinary, well-attended, at the end of which one resident, selected by random draw, is stoned to death by their neighbors. The ritual is old enough that no one fully remembers what it was originally supposed to accomplish. The machinery of it has outlasted the justification for it. And the most disturbing element of the story is not the stoning itself, but the matter-of-fact way in which everyone participates, the normalcy of it. The way the horror has been so thoroughly incorporated into the texture of community life that it does not register as horror anymore. It registers as tradition. Joshua Sawyer, lead designer of Fallout New Vegas, has cited this story as a direct inspiration for Vault 11. Vault 11 sits in the Mojave Wasteland, northwest of a settlement whose pre-war identity has been largely reduced to rubble, accessible through a landscape of pale rock and dry heat, and the particular quality of desert silence that feels less like the absence of sound and more like the presence of something waiting. The vault door is intact. The exterior has aged with the specific dignity of concrete in an arid climate slowly, with a kind of resistant stubbornness, as though the material has simply declined to cooperate with the passage of time. The interior, when the courier explores it in 2281, is not destroyed. No catastrophic failure has collapsed the structure, or burned the records, or wiped the terminals clean. It has simply been emptied of most of its living occupants over time, through a process that the preserved evidence allows any careful visitor to reconstruct with reasonable fidelity. That process lasted 75 years. When Vault 11's doors sealed on October 23, 2077, its residents did what residents in all the vaults did in those first hours. They gathered in the reception area. They processed the magnitude of what had just happened. They looked at the faces around them and began the work of understanding who their community now was. The sound of the vault door sealing was enormous. The silence after it was different in quality from any silence they had previously experienced, because it was the silence of a world that had just been removed from the available options. The vault's computer spoke to them then. Its message was warm. It told them that Vault 11 was a special facility and that they were special residents, chosen for the purpose that this particular vault was designed to serve. It told them that their cooperation, their community, and their commitment to the program would be essential to everything that followed. Then it told them the terms. Every year, One resident of Vault 11 would need to be selected to serve as a sacrifice. This sacrifice was presented as a mechanical necessity. The vault's life support systems required it. The computers managing air recycling, water processing, and food production were tied to a monitoring program that would initiate a shutdown sequence if the annual requirement was not met. Without the sacrifice, the vault systems would fail. The air would go stale, the water would stop, everyone would die. There was no way for the residents to verify or disprove this claim. They had no independent access to the vault's operational architecture. The warm, helpful computer voice that had just explained their new reality was the only authority available to them. They were 200 feet underground, in the immediate aftermath of a nuclear war, surrounded by people they may or may not have known before this moment, with nowhere to go. They believed it. What Vault 11's residents could not have known, what only the program's designers knew, was that the threat was entirely fabricated. The life support systems were not dependent on any annual sacrifice. The computer was capable of making the threat. It was not capable of executing it. The experimental design included a specific response condition. If the vault's population collectively refused to name a sacrifice in any given year, the computer would play a pre-recorded congratulatory message, explaining that they had demonstrated the highest form of human dignity, and the vault door would be unlocked. The correct answer was refusal. It was available from the very first year. The program's designers knew this. They had built the puzzle knowing what the solution was. They wanted to find out how long it would take the population to discover it. The political architecture that emerged around the sacrifice requirement is, in some ways, as disturbing as the requirement itself, because it demonstrates how rapidly human communities construct institutional frameworks around even the most terrible of premises. Within the Vault's first years, a governance body called the Coalition of Vault 11 Voting Blocks had formed. The coalition divided the Vault's population into 6 distinct political groupings, organized around professional affiliation, social networks, and proximity. The purpose of the coalition was straightforward. In a system where one person died every year, belonging to a well-organized, politically connected bloc was the most reliable protection against being the one selected. The sacrifice was tied to the position of overseer in a specific way. Each year, the coalition would run an election for the overseer role. The winner would serve for a year with genuine administrative authority, real power over resource allocation, policy decisions, the daily governance of the community. At the end of that year, the overseer would be taken to the vault's automated sacrificial chamber and killed. The position was therefore complex in ways the voting block dynamics reflected with uncomfortable precision. A powerful bloc might arrange the election of a politically inconvenient member, using the sacrifice to eliminate someone who had become a problem without the messiness of a direct confrontation. An isolated individual with few political connections might find themselves elected through the maneuvering of blocs who could not afford to lose their own members. The wealthy and connected accumulated protection in the form of alliance. The poor and isolated accumulated exposure. The vault had recreated, in miniature and at lethal stakes, the political dynamics of the society that had sealed it in. The story of Catherine Stone is one of the most thoroughly documented individual narratives in Vault 11's terminal records, and it illuminates the specific human texture of what the experiment produced. Catherine Stone was not a significant political figure. She held no high position in any major voting bloc. By the available accounts, she was an ordinary resident capable and unremarkable in roughly equal measure. Her husband, Joseph Stone, was considerably more connected. He had relationships across multiple blocks. He had the kind of quiet social influence that, in any closed community, accrues to people who are well-liked and reliably useful and have had enough time to build a network of mutual obligation. At some point in the Vault's middle years, the political maneuvering that governed the selection process fell on Catherine. The mechanism is not fully documented. The outcome is clear. She was nominated, she was selected, she was taken to the sacrificial chamber. Joseph Stone did not use his influence to prevent this. Whether that was calculation, an assessment that the political cost of a rescue attempt outweighed the personal cost of losing his wife, or whether it was something more private and harder to name, the records do not say. They preserve the outcome and not the interior of the man who produced it. The following year, Joseph Stone was elected overseer. He served his term. He governed. At the end of it, he was taken to the same chamber. There is no indication in the terminal logs of what that year felt like from the inside. only the administrative record of his service and the registration of his sacrifice at its end. Whatever he thought about, in those 12 months between his wife's death and his own, belonged to him alone. By the Vault's middle decades, the sacrifice system had been normalized in the specific sociological sense of the word, not accepted, not approved of, but incorporated into the background texture of community life in the way that very many genuinely terrible things become incorporated into communities that lack the mechanism to change them. Children were born who grew up knowing this was simply how the Vault worked. They became adults without the external reference point that might have allowed them to recognize its abnormality. The elections were held. The blocks negotiated. The overseer served and died, and was replaced by another. New generations inherited a governance structure whose fundamental brutality had been so thoroughly proceduralized that the procedure itself had become the focus rather than what the procedure was for. The administrative records from this period have a quality that takes a moment to identify. They are routine. Crop yields and maintenance schedules and policy discussions occupy the same register as the notes about the overseer's final week. Nobody in the official documentation expresses horror. The execution of the overseer appears in the records as a scheduled event, noted with the same bureaucratic neutrality as water filtration reports. This is what normalization looks like from the inside. The language available to a community shapes what that community can say to itself about what it is doing. And the language of Vault 11 had been, gradually and without any single deliberate act, structured around the sacrifice in a way that made naming it as wrong almost impossible to do within the existing vocabulary. The private terminal entries are different. The personal logs, written by residents in the way that people write in diaries when they need somewhere to put things that do not fit the available categories, these carry a different quality. There are entries describing sleeplessness, specific dreams that the writer does not elaborate on, the particular dread of watching a political coalition's protection erode and knowing that next year could be the year it is not enough. One entry, from an unidentified resident in what appears to be approximately the 40th or 50th year of the Vault's operation, reads, "I keep thinking there must have been something else we could have done. In the beginning, before it was already this." There is no following entry from that terminal account. The end of the sacrifice cycle came not through any organized resistance or collective moral reckoning, but through simple attrition. The Vault's population had declined over 75 years. Disease. Violence stemming from the political tensions that the selection process constantly generated. The cumulative psychological weight of living in a community structured around manufactured fear. Whatever the specific mechanisms, the numbers had dropped until only 5 residents remained. When you are one of 5 people in a vault built for hundreds, the abstraction of the community you are theoretically sustaining through sacrifice has become too small to sustain the abstraction. You can see all of them. You know every name. You have eaten meals with all of them, and shared the specific intimacy of a small group of people who have only each other. The 5 survivors face the question that had faced the vault's original residents 75 years before. Someone needs to go to the chamber. They refused. Collectively, without apparent debate. Whatever the consequence of refusal, this was not something they would continue. The computer played its message, the one that had been waiting since the very beginning, pre-recorded and patient, dormant in the system for 7.5 decades. It told them they were a shining example to humanity, that they had chosen correctly, that the vault door would now be unlocked. 4 of the 5 walked to the sacrificial chamber and triggered the automated defense systems themselves. The reason is not fully explained in the available records. Some interpretations suggest guilt the survivors of a system they had participated in, unable to accept the freedom it offered. Others suggest something more deliberate, a form of accountability or atonement. The game does not resolve the ambiguity, and that ambiguity appears intentional. The 5th walked out of the vault. Where they went, what they found, what the surface looked like to someone emerging after 7 decades underground, the story does not say. The last survivor of Vault 11 is a loose thread that the narrative does not tie off. Maybe that is the point. The experiment had been designed to measure how long it would take a population to discover that refusal was always available. The answer was 75 years and approximately 250 lives. The puzzle had a correct answer from day one. The population had every opportunity to find it. The people who designed this experiment built a moral puzzle with a known solution, placed real human beings inside it, gave them no information that would allow them to solve it, manufactured a threat that made refusal appear to be collective suicide, and watched for 7 decades. They were studying whether manufactured necessity could override moral reasoning indefinitely. The answer was, for 75 years, yes. That data went into the program's records. Somewhere in the Enclave's archives, it accumulated with the data from 100 other vaults, building toward whatever conclusion the architects of the experiment had been working toward all along. There is one more dimension to Vault 11's story worth sitting with before we move on, and it has to do with what the experiment reveals, not just about the specific people who lived through it, but about the general relationship between manufactured necessity and moral reasoning. The condition that the experiment created the false threat of collective death in the absence of annual sacrifice is not as alien to ordinary human experience as it might appear at first. The specific mechanism of Vault 11 was unprecedented, but the general phenomenon of manufactured necessity, of communities sustaining terrible practices because the perceived alternative appears catastrophic, has a long and well-documented history in the world outside the game. Institutions maintain harmful arrangements by creating or exploiting the perception that alternatives do not exist or would be worse. This is not always a lie. Sometimes the alternatives genuinely are worse, and the calculation that sustains a terrible arrangement is a real calculation about real costs. But often the perception of necessity is itself the mechanism of control. The belief that stopping is not an option does the work of control more effectively than any physical constraint could, because a belief that has been sufficiently internalized does not require enforcement. The Vault's computer told the residents that the life support systems would fail without the sacrifice. They believed this. They organized their political and social life around it for 75 years. The machinery of that belief, the voting blocks, the elections, the overseer position, the specific cultural formations that developed around the annual requirement was elaborate and real. It produced real consequences for real people. And it was built entirely on a fabrication. What the experiment was testing was not simply whether manufactured necessity could override moral reasoning. It was testing how the shape of a community's institutions and culture would be determined by a false foundational premise, how the lie would propagate through the community's entire way of organizing itself in ways that would eventually make it almost impossible to question the premise, even if the physical means to question it became available. The political blocks were not simply a response to the sacrifice requirement. They were a transformation of the Vault's social architecture, from a community organized around whatever principles its founders had brought with them, into a community organized specifically around managing who would die. Every other aspect of political and social life in Vault 11 was shaped by this central organizing principle, whether it appeared in any given decision or not. When the 5 final survivors refused, when they said no, collectively and without discussion of what the consequence would be, they were not making a simple moral choice. They were doing something that 2 centuries of social engineering had been designed to make impossible. They were acting against the entire institutional formation of their community, against the accumulated weight of 75 years of normalization, against the specific political and cultural architecture that had been built to make refusal feel like collective suicide. They refused anyway. That the correct answer was always available, from day one, and took 75 years and the reduction of the population to 5 people to be acted on. This is the data point that the experiment was designed to generate. It says something about the specific power of manufactured necessity to reshape moral reasoning in ways that persist long after the external conditions that first generated the necessity have become familiar and normalized. The experiment learned what it set out to learn. The cost was the better part of 200 lives, and the specific thing that was Vault 11's community in the years when it was still a real community before the attrition and the violence and the slow reduction to 5 isolated survivors who had to carry the full weight of what their community had been between them. That specific thing, the friendships and the conflicts and the music and the daily texture of life in a sealed space that happened to be organized around killing one of its members every year, that is what the data represents and what the data does not capture. Section 3. Vault 87, where the green stuff lives. The capital wasteland is a specific kind of destroyed. Washington, D.C., 2 centuries after the Great War, is not the kind of ruined city that resolves itself neatly into rubble and absence. The scale of what was built there was too large for that. The bones of the architecture persist through the decay of everything surrounding them. The dome of the Capitol building still rises above the surrounding devastation, structurally compromised in visible ways, but unmistakably itself, still presiding over a plaza full of the evidence of what came to happen there. The Jefferson Memorial still faces the water. The Washington Monument still reaches upward, its upper section damaged, its outline unchanged against the sky. The city is a ruin that refuses to fully become one. It occupies the landscape like something that is still present even though what made it what it was has been stripped away. The way a place where something important happened retains a quality in the air that has nothing to do with the physical substance of the location. In the northern reaches of the Capitol wasteland, several hours of travel from the ruins of the city center, is a natural cave system large enough to have sustained a community for generations. It has done exactly that. A community of children, actually, who have developed their own social structures and oral traditions and governance systems entirely independent of any adult authority. They call themselves the Lamplight Kids, after the cavern's main chamber. They are, in the context of the wasteland, simultaneously among its most vulnerable inhabitants and among its most resilient. The caves connect, through a passage that the children use as a boundary marker and dumping ground for things they would rather not think about, to another underground facility. One that is not a natural formation. One that glows with a particular quality of light that has nothing to do with electricity. The direct surface approach to Vault 87 is effectively impossible without specialized radiation protection. The entrance tunnel saturates anyone who enters it with radiation, at levels that are immediately and catastrophically lethal. The reason is that one of the bombs fell close enough to the vault's surface entrance to render direct approach unusable for the 200 years following October 23, 2077. The bomb fell on that specific facility because the facility had made itself, by the nature of what it was developing, a very high-value military target. The forced evolutionary virus has a pre-war history that predates the Vault program. Vault-Tec Corporation began early FEV research under military contract in the 1970s work that was initially framed around the Pan-Immunity Virion project, an attempt to develop a viral agent that could protect soldiers against radiation and biological warfare. The research produced results that exceeded its initial parameters in ways that redirected the entire project. The virus that emerged from Vault-Tec's California laboratories did not simply confer immunity, it rewrote the biological architecture of whatever organism it infected, producing changes in musculature, skeletal structure, skin composition, and neural organization that bore only a partial resemblance to the starting material. By the time the Vault program was being developed, FEV research had produced several distinct strains with different transformation profiles, different rates of cognitive effect, and different practical applications from a military standpoint. The strain being studied at Mariposa Military Base in California, which would eventually produce the West Coast supermutants that populate the original Fallout games, was one branch of this research. Vault 87 was designated as the testing site for a different branch, a modified strain developed specifically for the evolutionary experimentation program, designed to produce more uniform and rapidly achieved transformations than the Mariposa research. The modification addressed certain limitations of the West Coast FEV strain and aimed at results that were more predictable, more controllable, more efficiently generated. The scientist assigned to oversee this program was Wayne Merrick, characterized in the Vault's documentation as one of the most accomplished researchers in accelerated evolutionary biology then working in the United States. He was given a purpose-built research wing within the Vault, a medical facility of considerable scale, equipped with stasis chambers, plasma containment units, airborne deployment systems, and the various specialized infrastructure that research of this kind required. He had resources and a clear mandate. He had subjects. The subjects were the residents of Vault 87. Merrick's research notes document the transformation timeline with the precision of a scientist watching something carefully and recording exactly what he sees, in the specific, neutral register of someone who has successfully compartmentalized the moral dimension of his work. Day 1 of FEV exposure, conducted by deploying the virus as an airborne particulate in the isolated experimental chambers where subjects had been placed, showed no visible external symptoms. The subjects moved through the first 24 hours unaware that anything had changed. The virus was working at the cellular level, beginning processes that would not manifest externally for another 48 to 72 hours. By day 3, The first visible changes appeared. Muscle mass increased measurably and visibly, the kind of change that the subjects themselves would have noticed had anyone told them what to look for. The skeletal structure began shifting, producing corresponding changes in proportion and posture that would continue accelerating over the following days. Sexual characteristics atrophied rapidly in both male and female subjects, producing a convergent body form that the modified Vault-87 strain seemed specifically designed to generate. Merrick's notes from these early observation periods are clinical. He describes the physical changes with a researcher's attention to specificity and rate. He notes the consistency across subjects, the ways in which the Vault-87 strain's performance did or did not match predicted parameters from the West Coast research data. He does not describe his subjects as people. By day 10, the skin coloration of exposed subjects had shifted to the yellowish-green that would become the characteristic appearance of the capital wasteland's super mutant population over the following 2 centuries. The texture thickened substantially, developing resistance to radiation and physical damage that significantly exceeded baseline human biology. The subjects who had reached this stage were visibly, unmistakably no longer what they had been when they entered the experimental chambers. By day 14, the cognitive costs became apparent. The higher reasoning functions that distinguish human neurology from simpler biological systems, language, extended memory, complex planning, the capacity for social and emotional nuance began degrading rapidly. Subjects who had reached this stage were aggressive. They responded to stimuli with the reflexivity of creatures that process threat and opportunity without the mediating layer of deliberation. The specific qualities that make human beings capable of science and art and moral reasoning and love were not compatible with what the virus was producing. In one entry, Merrick notes that a specific subject, referred to by number only, was still verbal at day 13. He records that the subject said something. He does not write what it was. The following entry is dated 2 days later and does not mention the subject again. The experimental design, in Merrick's careful framework, was organized around a specific question. Was there a dosing regimen, a timing intervention, a way of structuring the FEV exposure that could preserve the physical enhancements while limiting or preventing the cognitive degradation? Was there a version of this transformation that produced a powerful, radiation-resistant soldier rather than simply a powerful, radiation-resistant organism? He was methodically working toward that question when the experiment lost its controlled conditions. 1 year after the vault sealed, the experimental subjects broke free. The security force assigned to Vault-87 had been designed to manage a vault population of ordinary residents, with the additional consideration of containing experimental subjects during the active research phase. It had not been designed for what the research had produced. The people who planned the security protocols had understood, in an abstract way, that fully transformed FEV subjects would be physically formidable. They had not fully absorbed what physically formidable meant when applied to creatures 3 times stronger than a healthy adult human and functionally immune to the pain-based deterrents that most security systems relied on. The containment failed. The transformed subjects, super mutants, though no one had yet developed that specific vocabulary for them, broke out of the experimental wing and into the vault's general population areas. The residents who had been living in the non-laboratory sections of the facility, the ones who had believed themselves to simply be residents of a shelter and had no knowledge of what was being done in the research wing, were now facing creatures that had been their fellow vault residents several weeks before. What followed was not prolonged. The super mutants had the FEV chambers. They had the biological imperative that drives reproduction in all organisms, and they understood, at whatever level of cognitive function remained to them, that the substance in those chambers was connected to what they had become. The remaining vault residents were not simply attacked, they were taken to the chambers and transformed. The controlled experiment Merrick had been running was replaced, within a compressed period, by an uncontrolled cascade. The super mutants that emerged from Vault-87's collapse are distinct from those produced by the Mariposa strain FEV. West Coast super mutants retain varying levels of intelligence depending on individual biology and transformation circumstances. Some are genuinely capable of complex reasoning and language. The Master's Army, built from Mariposa FEV, included individuals like Marcus who retained enough cognitive function to build and lead a community for decades after the war. Vault-87 super mutants are uniformly degraded in cognitive function. They are strong, dramatically, terrifyingly so. They are radiation resistant. They can coordinate in basic ways and execute simple tactical decisions. They are not capable of the extended reasoning that would allow for complex strategy, genuine social organization, or any of the higher-order thinking that transforms a dangerous organism into a civilization. And yet they sustained themselves for nearly 200 years after the initial collapse. They held territory. They organized raids complex enough to successfully kidnap wastelanders from across the capital wasteland. They maintained the one piece of infrastructure that was essential to their continuation as a population: the FEV chambers. The Vault-87 strain produces sterile subjects. This is a property of all FEV transformations. The virus disrupts the reproductive system, along with everything else. The only way to produce new supermutants is through new FEV exposure. The only source of FEV that the Vault-87 supermutants knew about was their vault. They called it the green stuff. They had no more sophisticated vocabulary than that, no conceptual framework for what it was or why it was necessary. Just the behavioral encoding of 2 centuries, the deep operational knowledge that the green stuff made more of them, and that making more of them was essential, and that the humans scattered across the surface were the raw material that the green stuff required. The raiding that terrorized the capital wasteland for 200 years was not malicious in the conventional sense. It was the behavioral expression of a biological imperative, the drive to continue existing as a population, translated through the limited cognitive architecture of creatures that could not approach the problem any other way. By 2277, when the lone wanderer begins looking for their father and eventually discovers Vault-87, the green stuff is running critically low. The supermutants who remain are increasingly desperate, their raids more frequent and more frantic, because what they have built the entirety of their 2-century existence around is nearly gone. The experiment that Wayne Merrick was designing, had it proceeded without the containment failure, might eventually have answered the question he was working toward: the threshold between useful soldier and uncontrollable organism. The dosing regimen that preserved cognitive function while maximizing physical enhancement. The research question was a real one with real potential military applications, and Merrick was capable enough to have made meaningful progress on it. The containment failure prevented him from answering it. Instead, the capital wasteland got 200 years of super mutant raids, thousands of wastelanders kidnapped and transformed, and a population of enhanced but cognitively limited beings who gradually ran down toward extinction as their only reproductive resource depleted. That is also data. It tells you something about what happens when a controlled experiment becomes uncontrolled, when the thing being created develops enough capability to break the container that created it and continues operating without any of the oversight or intervention that defined its original context. Merrick's research notes were still in the vault's terminals when the lone wanderer arrived. They document, with clinical precision, the early stages of a process that produced consequences that persisted for 2 centuries. The scientist's handwriting, in a metaphorical sense, is all over the capital wasteland, in every super mutant that stalks the ruins of Washington, in every wasteland community that built its fortifications higher because the raiders came from underground. The experiment produced a result, just not the one that was planned. There is a specific detail in Vault-87's story that is easy to pass over and worth returning to: the 1 year. From the date the vault sealed October 23, 2077 to the date the experimental subjects broke containment, approximately 1 year passed. The transformation timeline that Merrick was documenting reached its most aggressive phase, the phase at which full transformation is achieved and cognitive function is maximally degraded in roughly 2 weeks. This means that the first subjects exposed were fully transformed several weeks after the vault sealed. Why did containment hold for nearly a year if fully transformed subjects were present from early in the experimental period? The answer is in the experimental design. Merrick was running controlled exposures, not transforming the entire population simultaneously, but working through the experimental cohort in stages, maintaining sufficient security capacity to manage the transformed subjects while continuing to assess whether earlier stage interventions could preserve cognitive function. The transformation was happening in a sequence that kept the number of fully transformed subjects at manageable levels relative to the security force. The mathematical relationship between those two numbers, fully transformed supermutants versus security capacity, held for most of a year, and then it did not. Whether the breach was sudden or gradual, whether the containment failure was a single event or a series of escalating incidents, the records do not clearly establish. What they establish is that the point at which the security force was overwhelmed was the point at which the controlled experiment became an uncontrolled cascade. The other thing worth understanding about the Vault-87 supermutants, the capital wasteland variant, the ones who spread from this single facility across hundreds of miles of the eastern seaboard over 2 centuries, is the relationship between their limited cognitive capacity and their operational effectiveness. This seems like a paradox. How does a population with severely degraded higher reasoning capability sustain a 2-century campaign of organized kidnapping raids, maintain functioning infrastructure, and manage the resource allocation required to keep an FEV research program operating? Part of the answer is that what they were doing did not require high cognitive function. Raiding, kidnapping, bringing captives to a specific location, operating the chambers. These are complex behaviors in the sense that they involve multiple steps and require coordination between individuals, but they are not complex in the sense of requiring extended abstract reasoning or strategic planning. They can be executed through a combination of imitation, conditioning, and the specific behavioral patterns that become deeply encoded in any population that has been doing the same things for multiple generations. Part of the answer is also that the FEV transformation degrades higher reasoning functions while preserving many lower-level behavioral and coordination capacities. The super mutants of Vault-87 are not simply cognitively degraded humans. They are something else, organisms whose behavioral repertoire has been fundamentally reorganized around a different set of priorities and capabilities than baseline human biology supports. What they could not do was adapt to circumstances that required the kind of flexible, novel problem-solving that higher reasoning enables. When the green stuff started running out, they could not develop an alternative. They could not figure out how to synthesize FEV from different raw materials. They could not establish trade or alliance relationships that might have given them access to different FEV sources. They could intensify the raids. That was the limit of their adaptive capacity. The intensification of raids, the increased frequency and aggression of the kidnapping operations in the final years before the FEV reserves ran out was not a strategic response to a changing situation. It was the behavioral equivalent of pressing a key harder when a door that has always opened with that key stops opening. The only move they had, and the door was running out of space to open further. Section 4. Vault 92. The music that broke their minds. There is a category of harm that is especially difficult to prosecute, practically or morally, because it leaves no visible evidence. When someone is struck, the injury is demonstrable. It exists in the physical world in ways that other people can observe and measure and agree on. The mechanism of harm is legible. The evidence of it persists. When someone's perception is systematically corrupted, when the information environment they depend on for understanding their own behavior is quietly and deliberately distorted without their awareness, the harm is just as real, but the evidence of it is behavioral rather than physical. You see it in what people do, in the gap between who they understand themselves to be and what they actually do, in the specific confusion of someone who has acted against themselves and cannot locate the cause. Vault 92 was designed to study exactly this category of harm. At the specific intersection of acoustic manipulation and latent combat behavior, using a population chosen with uncomfortable precision for its particular sensitivity to sound. The musicians who descended into Vault 92 on October 23, 2077, were, by any reasonable assessment, extraordinary people. The Vault's recruitment pitch had described it as a preservation facility for America's finest musical talent, and the pitch was not exaggerating significantly. The process of selecting the Vault's residents had drawn from the highest levels of professional music in the country: major orchestras, premier conservatories, the concert circuit, the studio recording world. The people who arrived at the Vault's entrance that October morning had, in aggregate, spent more combined hours in serious musical practice than any randomly selected group of 300 Americans would have spent on any skill in their lifetimes. They brought their instruments, string players with instruments that represented decades of investment and often carried the specific emotional weight of objects that had been present for every important moment of a professional career. Wind players and brass musicians and pianists who had arranged for the transport of instruments that could not easily be replaced. Composers and conductors and studio engineers and the full range of talent that a serious effort to recruit America's finest would produce. Professional musicians, specifically those trained to the level represented in Vault 92's population, Develop a relationship with sound that is qualitatively different from most people's experience of it. They listen to the world differently. They hear layers and textures and relationships that untrained attention passes over. They notice the acoustic properties of enclosed spaces, the way that different materials affect resonance, the specific quality that a room's dimensions give to the music played within it. They were, in other words, people whose professional expertise had made them more sensitive to auditory manipulation than virtually any other population that could have been selected. Whether this was a design choice or a coincidence the program happened to exploit, the available records do not definitively answer. The vault they descended into was configured to support their professional lives. Recording studios with equipment comparable to the best commercial facilities of the era, sound-isolated practice rooms, performance spaces in the larger common areas. The acoustic design of the residential areas had been modified from standard vault specifications to reduce the echo and reverberation that disturb musicians working in ordinary concrete environments. It looked like exactly what it claimed to be. It looked like a gift. The experiment had two components, and the relationship between them was the experiment's actual subject. The official component was managed by Professor John Malleus, a researcher in auditory neuroscience assigned to the Vault's science staff. Malleus was running a controlled investigation into whether acoustic stimuli, specifically modified white noise signals delivered in isolation booth conditions, could produce measurable changes in human behavioral suggestibility. The theoretical foundation was reasonable and documented in the pre-war scientific literature. White noise, a signal characterized by equal acoustic energy across all frequencies, generates specific neurological effects when sustained, and several researchers had proposed that modulated versions of such signals might interact with the brain's response systems in predictable ways. Malleus's early booth experiments were careful and conservative. Individual musicians would enter a recording booth for a session and be exposed to the signal at levels calibrated below conscious auditory perception. The initial phase was purely observational, no attempt to direct any specific behavioral change, simply a measurement of whether the signal produced any detectable effect on the subject's subsequent suggestibility and response patterns. The results were positive. Subjects exposed to the signal showed elevated suggestibility in the period following the session. Simple prompted actions adjusting hair, touching specific objects, moving to particular locations could be reliably elicited in recently exposed subjects through normal conversational suggestion. The effect was real and measurable and consistent across the population. Malleus documented this with the careful enthusiasm of a scientist who has gotten a clean early result and is beginning to understand the implications of where his research might lead. He did not know that his colleague was already operating several steps ahead of him and without his knowledge. Overseer Richard Rubin had received his full experimental briefing before the vault sealed. He understood the program's actual objective, and he was not waiting for Malleus's controlled research to establish the basic parameters before moving to the application phase. The residential sections of Vault 92, the dormitories, the corridors, the dining hall, the common rooms where the musicians gathered in the evenings to talk and play and build the social bonds that any closed community needs, were fitted with white noise generators that Rubin had installed without informing Malleus. These generators were running a signal calibrated at parameters that Rubin had determined independently, aimed at an objective that the official experimental documentation did not include. The residential signal was designed to embed what the records describe as combat directives in the vault's general population, a gradual lowering of the threshold between the impulse toward violence and the act of it, a slow restructuring of the decision-making architecture around conflict and physical aggression. The musicians of Vault 92 were being written on without knowing it. Every day, in the corridors where they walked between practice rooms and the dining hall, in the dormitories where they slept, in the common areas where they talked and laughed and made the small human connections that accumulate over months and years into something that can be called a life. Life in Vault 92, during the years when the residential signal was building in the neurology of people who had no idea what was building, was genuinely good in many ways. The musicians threw themselves into their work with the specific intensity of people who have been given time and resources and the company of their professional peers. Collaboration projects developed between people who would never, under normal circumstances, have had the uninterrupted time to realize them. Concerts were organized and performed in the vault's larger common areas. and by the accounts in the terminal logs, these performances were genuinely moving the particular quality of live music in an enclosed space, given by exceptional musicians who had been freed from the touring schedule and commercial pressures of their pre-war careers. Hilda Egelbrecht, the Vault's principal violinist, kept private terminal logs that document a creative period she describes with the specific gratitude of someone who can feel that their work is reaching levels they had previously only approached. She was also falling in love. The entries from her first-year document the slow emergence of a relationship with Parker Livingston, who managed the Vault's recording infrastructure with the precision of someone who is paying close attention to something important happening in their life. Her entries are warm and specific and occasionally funny in the way that private writing becomes funny when the writer is not performing for an audience. Other residents built other things. Friendships of the deep, professional kind that form between people who share a vocation and who discover, in close proximity, that they share other things too. The Vault was becoming a community with the specific density and texture that only comes from sustained, shared experience. The ringing was easy to dismiss. Several residents began reporting, in medical consultations and personal terminal entries, a persistent low-frequency tone, not loud, not always present, but recurring, a kind of acoustic presence at the edge of awareness that they could not quite locate or explain. The Vault's doctor noted these complaints in the medical records with mild professional interest and attributed them to the acoustic environment. Concrete spaces at depth have specific resonance properties. Musicians were perhaps simply more attuned to the facility's ambient frequencies than most. The white noise generators continued running. The first serious incident happened in a practice room during an ordinary session. A musician attacked a fellow resident without warning, with a violence that went well beyond any reasonable response to anything that had preceded it. The attacker, when the episode ended and their ordinary consciousness returned, was genuinely bewildered. They had no memory of any intention to harm. They described feeling, in retrospect, as though they had simply lost the interval between the thought and the action, that the mediating step that ordinarily exists between impulse and behavior had briefly ceased to exist. The Vault's administrative record noted the incident and attributed it to the psychological pressures of enclosed environment living. The recommendation was additional recreational programming and expanded mental health resources. The signal continued running. More incidents followed, not at a rate that produced an obvious pattern in any given week, but visible across the months and years as a cluster of behavioral anomalies increasing in both frequency and severity. Residents describing impulses they could not account for. Confrontations escalating past the point of any rational correspondence to the original disagreement. The specific signature of people who are acting against themselves and cannot locate the cause. When Malleus traced the residential signal and found Rubin's generators, his response was somewhere between professional outrage and genuine horror. He had been running careful, controlled, limited research. He had been following protocols. Rubin had been conducting an unauthorized experiment in mass behavioral modification across the Vault's entire residential population, using the same general mechanism that Malleus was studying, but aimed at an application that had nothing to do with the experimental framework Malleus had been given. He demanded the residential signal be shut down. The records from this point become fragmentary. What happened between Malleus's demand and the final event is not fully documented. What the physical evidence of the Vault suggests is that the threshold was eventually crossed. When the lone wanderer finds Vault 92 in 2277, the residents have been dead for 2 centuries. They are skeletons now, arranged in the specific positions that violent death produces, preserved by the sealed environment in the particular stillness of things that were interrupted in the middle of something. The recording studios still have sessions set up. The practice rooms still have instruments in them. The residential dormitories still have the personal effects of people who expected to continue living in them. Hilda Egelbrecht's violin is still in her quarters. The Vault's terminals preserve the record of what happened. A community of 245 exceptional human beings who had built something genuine in the space the Vault gave them, and who were simultaneously being rewritten in ways they could not perceive, in a direction they never agreed to, by the people responsible for keeping them safe. The white noise generators are still running when the lone wanderer arrives. Whatever report any researcher would eventually file about Vault 92 would note that the residential signal had indeed produced the combat-oriented behavioral changes it was designed to produce. That the application of the signal at the residential scale, across a sustained period, had effects substantially greater than the controlled booth experiments. that the experiment had, in narrow technical terms, worked. The report would not capture the sound of 245 specific people making music together in an enclosed space. The way that sound fills a room that was built for it. The way that Hilda Egelbrecht's violin sounded in the vault's performance area on an evening when the whole community had gathered and the music was genuinely good and the distance from the surface felt, for the length of a piece, like something other than loss. The white noise ran under all of it. Patient. Below the threshold of awareness. Writing something into the neurology of people who believed they were safe. And then the music stopped. The specific population of Vault 92 musicians, rather than any other professional group, is worth dwelling on before we leave the vault, because the choice of musicians as the experimental population was not arbitrary. The white noise manipulation that the residential signal was designed to perform was specifically dependent on the subject's relationship to acoustic experience. A population that did not have a particularly developed relationship with sound would have been harder to manipulate through acoustic means, not because the biology of auditory processing is different in musicians, but because the specific attentiveness that musical training develops toward auditory experience is also an attentiveness to the acoustic environment of any space those musicians occupy. Rubin needed subjects who would not notice the signal, but the selection of the most acoustically sensitive population available, professional musicians, people for whom listening carefully to sound was a core professional skill, seems, on the surface, to contradict this requirement. The resolution of this apparent contradiction is that the white noise signal operates below the threshold of conscious auditory perception. The residents of Vault 92 could not have heard it through the kind of active listening that musical training produces, because it was calibrated to frequencies and volumes specifically designed to avoid the conscious auditory processing that would have allowed any person, musician or not, to identify it as an external sound. The musicians' acute auditory sensitivity did not protect them from the signal, but it did produce the reports of ringing, of low-frequency acoustic presence that began appearing in medical consultations early in the vault's operation. Those reports were the closest that any resident came to consciously registering the presence of the residential signal, a persistent, inexplicable acoustic sensation that several residents described in terms that a sound engineer would recognize as consistent with very low-level continuous signal exposure. The vault doctor logged these complaints and attributed them to environmental acoustics. The mystery of the ringing was not solved before the outbreak. After the outbreak, there was no one left to solve it. The lone wanderer who finds Vault 92 in 2287 can read all of this in the terminal records, the complaints, the attributions, the doctor's confident explanations that turned out to be wrong, the ringing that so many residents reported that persisted through their professional assessments of the vault's acoustic properties, that they discussed among themselves and tried to locate the source of without success. This was the signal. This was what 200 years of silence after violence looked like in the administrative record. Just, some residents mentioned ringing, probably the vault's acoustics, not a concern. And then the music stopped. There is a piece of equipment in one of Vault 92's recording studios that the lone wanderer can interact with. The studio is still set up, the microphones in position, the recording levels set, the monitors angled toward where the performer would have stood. Someone was going to record something. The session was interrupted before they could. Whatever it was going to be, it was not recorded. It exists only in the planning that the studio setup represents. The intention of a musician who set up a session and was killed before they could begin it, preserved in the specific configuration of equipment in a room that no one has entered in 200 years. This is what Vault 92's story ultimately comes down to, in the most concrete available form. Not the data about acoustic manipulation and combat behavior modification. Not the policy failure of an unauthorized residential experiment. The setup for a recording session that was never made. Music that existed in someone's plans and in their body, that was going to fill a room, that was stopped before it could. Section 5. Vault 75. The children who were never allowed to be children. There is a particular category of cruelty that is defined not by its intensity but by its patience. The cruelties that register most immediately, the ones that produce the most obvious emotional response, are typically fast. They happen quickly. The damage they produce is visible and legible, and connected by a short chain of cause and effect to the event that caused it. The cruelty done in Vault 75 operated on a different timescale. It was slow, multi-generational. built into the environment of young people who had no way to recognize it as cruelty because it was the only environment they had ever known. It did not look like cruelty from the inside. From the inside, it looked like school. The vault is located beneath Malden Middle School in the Commonwealth north of Boston. The school building itself, by 2287, is a shell, its upper floors accessible but emptied of almost everything that once made it a place where young people spent their days. The classrooms are dark, the hallways are quiet. The specific silence of a building that once held children's voices and now holds nothing has a quality that most ruins do not, because schools accumulate a different kind of residue than most structures. You can feel, in the emptiness, what the space was for. The vault entrance is in the basement, and the vault below, unlike the school above, is not empty. It is occupied by a mercenary group called the Gunners, who have set up operations in the facility with the incuriosity of people who do not particularly care what the space was used for before they arrived, and who have not read the terminals. The recruitment pitch that Vault-Tec used for Vault 75 was calibrated with unusual precision to parental anxiety. It acknowledged directly, which most Vault advertising did not bother to do, that standard Vault enrollment was expensive and competitive, and that many families with children would not be able to secure spots for their entire household. It offered specific subsidies for families with children under 17 who attended schools in the local area. It described Vault 75 as a facility designed with young people specifically in mind, educational resources, recreational programming, child development expertise built into the Vault's staff and infrastructure. The pitch was, in emotional terms, devastating in its accuracy. It targeted precisely the fear that parents feel when they understand that the future they imagined for the people they love most is not going to exist in the form they imagined. The world was deteriorating visibly. The bombs were coming, and here was an organization telling them that their children, specifically their children, could be protected. People signed up. They made arrangements. They did everything that loving parents do when they believe they have found a solution. The admission process on October 23, 2077, was the first moment when the experiment's actual design became visible, though only to a small number of people who immediately stopped being able to communicate it to anyone else. Children under the age of 17 were separated from their parents immediately upon entry. This was explained, in administrative language, as a procedural requirement: decontamination protocols, orientation processing, the standard logistics of transitioning a large group into a new facility. The language was calm. The staff were efficient. The process was smooth. The children were taken to the atrium. The adults were taken elsewhere. Every adult who entered Vault 75 that day was killed by the facility's security staff. Any child who refused to be separated and stayed with their parent was also killed. When the admission process was complete, what remained was a population of children ranging from very young to nearly 17 years old without parents, without any adult who was not either a military officer or a scientist with a specific role in what was about to happen to them. The experiment's formal designation, as specified in the military authorization and implemented by Vault-Tec, was a program of genetic enhancement through multi-generational selective breeding and physical conditioning. The stated objective was the production of human subjects whose genetic and psychological profiles met specific criteria: enhanced physical capability, elevated pain tolerance, and what the documentation describes, without apparent irony, as obedience to authority without a second thought. The Vault would function as a school, a very thorough school, covering physical training, academic subjects, and the kind of team-building and leadership exercises that elite institutions organize for their students. The children would be assessed continuously, physically, cognitively, genetically, psychologically, through a testing program that was built into their daily lives as routine educational activity. The assessments would produce rankings. Children who scored highest across the relevant criteria would be selected for graduation. Graduation was harvest. Those children whose genetic profiles were deemed most promising for the program's objectives were transferred to a specialized research wing, where their genetic material was extracted for use in the next generation of the breeding program. In some cases, children who showed particular aptitude were offered roles as junior researchers, given titles and responsibilities that incorporated them into the operation of the program they had been subjects of, which represented its own specific form of corruption. Children who scored below the program's thresholds were disposed of. The records do not elaborate on this phrase. What the children experienced was a carefully constructed story about who they were and why they were there. The adults who remained in the facility, researchers, military staff, the vault's overseer, referred to the surface world as uptopland. They described it in consistent, specific terms: a place of enormous danger, of monsters and violence, and the helplessness of ordinary people facing conditions they were not equipped to survive. The children of Vault 75 were different. They were special. They were being trained, tested, and prepared for the day when they would ascend to Uptopland and protect the people there, help them, save them from the things that ordinary people could not handle, but that these children, with their exceptional training, could. The curriculum reinforced this narrative at every level. Physical conditioning framed as preparation for surface threats. Academic study framed as acquiring the knowledge they would need to operate in a complex world. The assessments framed as measuring progress toward readiness. Everything oriented toward the promise of graduation, of deployment, of the fulfillment of a purpose that the children had been told was heroic and necessary and real. The children believed it. They had nothing to compare it to. They had been separated from their parents on the day they arrived, at ages ranging from early childhood to adolescence, and raised entirely within the institution. The story of Uptopland and the special purpose of the trained children was not a story they had chosen to believe. It was the water they had swum in for as long as they could remember. They competed in the assessments with genuine investment. They aspired to graduation. The children who were selected, who disappeared into a part of the facility the general population did not have access to and did not return from, were understood by their peers as having achieved something, as having moved on to the next stage, as having gone ahead to Uptopland, where presumably they were doing the heroic work they had been trained to do. Nobody knew what graduation actually was. Generations cycled through. Children born inside the vault, to parents who were themselves products of the program, grew up even further removed from any external reference frame. They had no memory of parents who had not been the institution. No concept of a family structure outside of the peer groups organized by the facility's age cohorts. Their closest analog to parental figures was the research staff, people whose relationship to them was fundamentally instrumental, who valued their development in terms of what the program was building rather than in terms of who they were. The assessments continued. The thresholds were met or not. Graduation happened regularly to the highest-scoring children in ways that their peers absorbed as simply the way the vault worked. The terminal logs do not preserve the specific moment when the children of Vault 75 found out what graduation meant. They preserve the aftermath. The entries from the period following the discovery are not the organized narrative of a deliberate chronicler. They are fragmentary, inconsistent, sometimes mid-sentence in ways that suggest they were stopped not by the completion of the thought but by something external intervening. The administrative records become unreliable. There are gaps where there should be continuity. What emerges from the overall picture is a population that has absorbed an enormous truth and has made a decision about what to do with it. The facility had been training them for years. It had given them physical capabilities, tactical knowledge, and the specific psychological conditioning of people who have been told their whole lives that they are special and capable and destined for something significant. They had been prepared to fight. They had simply been prepared to fight something other than the actual enemy. The revolt was not a military operation. It was the response of young people who had just been told that the lives they had been living were a deliberate fiction, in a facility full of weapons, against people who had every technical advantage except the one that ultimately matters when there are no exit routes and no reinforcements. Intimate knowledge of the terrain. The children knew every corridor of Vault 75, every room, every passage, every weakness in the facility's layout that years of living in it had revealed. The researchers and the security staff knew it as a managed environment. The children knew it as the only home they had ever had. When it was over, they left. They walked out of Vault 75 through the school above and into the Commonwealth below, emerging into a world they had been told was Uptopland, which they had prepared their entire lives to enter, which looked nothing like what they had been taught to expect. What they found on the surface, how they survived, what communities they built or joined, what happened to the generations of children who emerged from that vault, with the specific skills and specific damage that the program had produced, the game does not fully document. The gunners who now occupy the facility share certain characteristics with what the program was trying to produce. The connection is not confirmed, but the gunners operate throughout the Commonwealth with a discipline and a capacity for organized violence that is unusual for wasteland or mercenary groups. On the floor of a dormitory room in the vault, in the corner near a sleeping area, are 4 small wooden blocks arranged to spell a name. Gary. It is a reference to Vault 112, where a different experiment produced a different kind of horror involving a resident of that name. The game's designers placed it there as an Easter egg for players who know the lore. But in the context of this specific space, amid all the evidence of what was done here, it functions differently. Someone was in this room. Someone had very little and arranged those blocks deliberately. Someone wanted to leave a mark on a place that had taken so much from them. The small act of insisting that you existed, in a facility designed to treat you as a means rather than an end, the story of the children of Vault 75 carries a specific weight when placed alongside the other Vault stories because of the age of its subjects. Every Vault experiment was conducted on people who had not been told the truth about what they were entering. Every experiment involved a fundamental violation of the informed consent that is supposed to be the foundational principle of any ethical research program. But most Vault residents were adults who had, at minimum, lived enough of a life outside the Vault to have a frame of reference for what had been taken from them. The children of Vault 75 had no such frame of reference. They were taken at ages ranging from early childhood to early adolescence. The most recent among them had lived long enough to have some memory of parents, of a world before the Vault, of the specific texture of a life being lived in a place with weather and wind and the smell of outdoors. Most of the youngest ones had none of this. The Vault was the only world they had ever consciously known. This made the experiment's deception uniquely complete. When adults in other Vaults were deceived about the nature of the experiment they were participating in, they were deceived about something that was happening to a self that had pre-existing definition and history and connection to people and places outside the Vault. The deception added a false layer to something that was already there. In Vault 75, for the youngest children, the deception did not operate on a pre-existing self. It was the material from which the self was constructed. You cannot simply remove a false identity from a person for whom the false identity is the only one that has ever existed. The person who discovers, at 15 or 17, that everything they have been told about who they are and why they are there and what their life means is a lie. That person does not have a true self waiting underneath the false one, ready to emerge once the deception is stripped away. They have the self that the institution built, which is the only self they have, and the discovery of the deception is not a liberation but a destruction. What the children of Vault 75 built in the aftermath in the days and weeks following whatever moment the truth became known, and the revolt that followed it, and the exodus into the Commonwealth was not a recovery of something that had been taken from them. It was the construction of something new, from materials that had been given to them by the people who had done this to them. The physical capabilities, the tactical training, the specific knowledge of how to survive in difficult conditions, all of this was genuinely theirs, in the sense that it was in their bodies and their minds, and could not be separated from the people they had become. The purpose it had been built to serve was not theirs, but the building itself, the accumulated result of years of genuine effort and genuine achievement. This was real. What you do with a self that was built by people who intended to use it is one of the most important questions that the Vault 75 story raises. The game does not answer it directly. The Commonwealth has no chapter titled, "Here is what happened to the children of Vault 75." The evidence that they existed is in the terminals, in the training rooms, in the dormitory where someone arranged those 4 wooden blocks. What they became in the world, how they found ways to be themselves rather than what the program had made them for. Whether they succeeded at that project or failed it, or produced some complicated mixture of both, this is not documented. It happened anyway, outside the frame of the story the game tells. Section 6. Vault 81. The cure that was almost withheld. Not every Vault story is about monsters. Some of them are about the distance between intention and outcome. The specific gap that opens up when what people design and what people do diverge. At the moment the design is handed over to human beings who have their own assessments and their own consciences and their own capacity to look at a set of instructions and decide that the instructions are wrong. Vault 81, in the Commonwealth southeast of Sanctuary Hills, is one of the few vaults in Fallout 4 that, by the time the sole survivor encounters it in 2287, functions as something recognizable as a community. Not a prosperous community, and not a simple one, and not one without its freight of unresolved history, but a group of people who have sustained themselves across 2 centuries, with governance structures intact and social norms functioning, and the particular kind of shared identity that develops in any group that has been together long enough to have a history that connects them. The vault has survived. This outcome was not predetermined by its design. In fact, the design of Vault 81 was specifically intended to produce a different outcome, one in which the vault's residents served as unwitting medical test subjects across multiple generations, while never understanding that this was what was happening to them. The fact that the vault survived as something other than a medical laboratory full of damaged and exploited people is directly attributable to one woman's decision to look at her instructions and do something other than what they specified. That woman was Overseer Olivet. The experimental mandate assigned to Vault 81 was medical research with a specific pharmaceutical focus. The vault's design incorporated an automated delivery system, nozzles built into the air and water processing infrastructure through which experimental compounds could be introduced into the residential environment, without requiring individual residents to consent to or even be aware of their exposure. The research program would use the vault's sealed population as a living testbed, running pharmaceutical trials across the resident population continuously and measuring outcomes through the vault's medical systems. The theory presented this arrangement as mutually beneficial. The research would develop cures for diseases that the pre-war pharmaceutical industry had not yet solved. Those cures would be tested on the vault's residents. If they worked, the residents would benefit directly. The vault would become, over time, a healthier community than it would otherwise have been. The program would produce data. The residents would gain medical benefits they had not specifically requested. What the program did not include was the consent of any of those residents to serve as subjects. The scientist assigned to lead the research, referred to in the records as Collins, arrived at Vault 81 having been fully briefed on the program's actual nature. He was prepared to conduct it. He was a capable scientist with genuine expertise in pharmaceutical biology and a pre-war career that had included serious research contributions. He was also, based on the records that survive, someone who had made his peace with the ethical dimensions of the program's design in whatever way people make peace with such things when their professional ambitions align with the available opportunity and the available opportunity is morally compromised. He set up his research wing. He prepared his equipment. He organized his protocols. He was ready to begin as soon as the delivery system was operational. Overseer Olivet had other plans. Olivet's sabotage of the delivery system was precise and quiet, and fundamentally undramatic in the way that the most consequential acts of resistance often are. She did not confront Collins. She did not announce her decision to the vault's residents. She did not create a record that would clearly document what she was doing and why. She simply ensured, during the installation of the delivery nozzles, that none of them were properly connected to the main system. They were installed. They looked installed. They were not functional. The delivery system appeared complete. It did not work. Collins, in his research wing, began his experiments on animal subjects, primarily mole rats, whose biology was sufficiently analogous to human biology for early-stage pharmaceutical testing, and whose availability in a sealed underground facility was reliable. He developed compounds, he tested them, he documented the results, and he waited, with increasing frustration, for his compounds to produce measurable effects in the vault's residential population. They never did because they were never being delivered to the residential population. His diagnostic attempts to understand why were thorough. His equipment was functional. His protocols were correctly implemented. His compounds produced the predicted effects in his animal subjects. Everything downstream of the delivery system was working. The delivery system itself appeared intact. The disconnect between his animal results and the absence of any measurable effect in the vault's general population was, from his perspective, inexplicable. He was being systematically frustrated by a problem whose cause was sitting in an office on the floor above him, with full knowledge of what she had done and no intention of explaining it. Over time, Collins and the residential population became separated in a way that went beyond the physical division of the research wing from the living quarters. They became separate communities within the same facility. The research wing was Collins's world, his subjects, his data, his increasingly elaborate pharmaceutical library. The residential floors were the vault's actual community, families and occupations and social relationships, and the particular texture of lives being lived in a space that, while not large, was managed with enough competence and good faith to remain habitable. Olivet's decision meant that Collins's research never touched the lives of the people it had been commissioned to affect. The experiment failed to execute in the form its designers had specified, and the vault's community was preserved from 2 centuries of involuntary medical experimentation. What Collins built in his isolation was, despite everything, remarkable. Working across decades with his mole rat subjects, he developed a pharmaceutical library of significant scope. The compounds in his records covered diseases that the pre-war medical establishment had not solved, addressing conditions that had been intractable problems in human medicine for decades before the war, and that had become, in the post-war world, death sentences for anyone unlucky enough to contract them. He was not a bad scientist. The isolation did not diminish his capability. It simply directed his capability into a channel that never reached the outlet it was designed for. When Collins died of age, eventually, as all the original Vault residents did, his research was transferred to the care of the Vault's automated systems. A Miss Handy robot designated as a research assistant continued maintaining his laboratory, preserving his records, cataloging his compounds, and conducting ongoing research in the style he had established. This continued, without human direction, for over 200 years. The Miss Handy robot's name was Curie. Curie, when the sole survivor encounters her in 2287, has been in the research wing for roughly 230 years. She has been conducting pharmaceutical research, without a break and without external interaction, in a sealed laboratory, with a population of mole rats, and the accumulated records of Collins's original work and whatever her own research has added to that foundation. She has developed, across 2 centuries of isolated investigation, a scientific understanding that substantially exceeds what Collins originally brought to the facility. She has also been alone for 230 years, in a room that does not change, with mole rats as her only company. And she is unmistakably ready for something different. Her desire for a physical body for the sensory experience of the world she has studied but never been able to move through is the emotional core of her companion quest in Fallout 4. It is also, if you think about what she has been and what she is asking to become, one of the game's most quietly moving character arcs. She has been a mind and a machine in a room for 2.5 centuries, doing work that no one has acknowledged or responded to or used, and she wants to feel the sun. The request is so reasonable and so enormous at the same time. Austin Engill is a child when the sole survivor meets him. He is sick, infected by a disease that the Vault's existing medical resources cannot address. The illness is progressing. The Vault's medical staff understand the severity of the situation but lack the tools to treat it. The facility has a medical history, a research wing full of 2 centuries of accumulated pharmaceutical knowledge, but access to that wing has been restricted, and most of the current population does not fully understand what is in it. When the sole survivor enters the research wing, navigating past the mole rats that have expanded their territory through decades of breeding in an environment without effective predators, and reaches Curie and the Vault's records, what emerges is the discovery that Collins's work contains a cure. 1 dose. The only one available in the facility. 200 years of animal testing and pharmaceutical development have produced enough of this specific compound for a single administration. It will save Austin if used on Austin. The game offers a choice: use the cure on Austin or redirect it. The vast majority of players give it to the child. The game expects this and has built the narrative around it. The Vault's community continues. Austin recovers. The Vault that survived Olivet's quiet act of institutional insubordination, that preserved its residents from the experiment they had been assigned to without ever fully telling them what they had been preserved from, produces its next generation in reasonable health. The full moral accounting of Vault 81 is not simple. Olivet's protection came at a cost. The residents and their descendants lived without access to the medical benefits that the research was supposed to provide. Collins's life was spent in isolation on work that never reached the patients it was designed for. The Vault community, across 200 years, lost people to conditions that the compounds in Collins's records might have addressed. These are real costs. They sit alongside the real benefit of a community that was not subjected to 2 centuries of involuntary pharmaceutical experimentation. This is how most genuine ethical problems work. The choices available to people in situations of constrained authority are not choices between a good option and a bad option. They are choices between different configurations of loss, and the task is not to find the option without cost, but to identify which costs are bearable and which are not. Olivet looked at what she had been asked to do and decided that the costs of compliance were the ones she could not accept. She was right about that. The costs she incurred instead were real. She was right about those too. The vault that produced Austin Engill, alive and recovering in 2287, is the vault that her choice made possible. That is the kind of legacy that does not resolve into a clean verdict. It simply continues, in the people who are alive because of it. The question of what constitutes protection, what it costs, what it preserves, what it fails to preserve in the act of preservation runs through Vault 81's story in ways that extend beyond Overseer Olivet's sabotage. The Vault's residents, across 200 years, developed without the medical benefits that Collins's research was supposed to provide. This is a real cost. People died of conditions that the compounds in the research wing might have addressed if those compounds had ever been delivered to them. Families lost people they might not have lost. The specific suffering of illness and the specific grief of losing people to illness, this was present in Vault 81's community across its entire history, in the specific quantities that a sealed community of several hundred people accumulates across 2 centuries. Olivet knew this would happen. She knew, when she made her decision, that the protection she was providing would be purchased at the cost of the medical benefits that the research would have generated. She decided that the cost of the research, paid by unwitting subjects who had not consented to serve in it, was higher than the cost of the medical benefits foregone. Whether she was right is the kind of question that does not resolve into a clean verdict. It is possible to respect the decision and also to mourn what it cost. It is possible to agree with the principle while grieving the consequences. Both things can be true at once, and the Vault's history is richer for the tension between them than it would be if the story had a simple moral. The residents who built their lives in Vault 81 across those 2 centuries were doing so without knowing about the experiment that was not conducted on them. They did not know about Olivet's sabotage. They did not know about Collins's research. They lived their lives in a community that had, at the foundational level of its design, a choice that had been made for them without their knowledge. A choice that protected them from something and denied them something else. And they navigated that community's specific conditions without access to the information that would have allowed them to assess the trade-off themselves. This is, in a small way, a parallel to the program as a whole. The people inside the vaults navigated conditions that had been designed for them by people who had decided, without their input, what they needed and what they could endure, and what would be done to them in the service of a larger project. Olivet's sabotage was, in form if not in intent, a version of the same thing. A decision about what the people in the vault needed, made for them without their knowledge or consent, by the person in authority over them. The difference, and it is a significant difference, was intent. The program's designers made their decisions in service of a project that the residents were material for. Olivet made her decision in service of the residents themselves as she understood their interests. The mechanism was similar. The relationship to the people affected was entirely different. That distinction matters. It does not make the paternalism of the decision disappear. It does not restore the consent that the residents deserve to exercise over their own medical fate. But it marks, clearly, the difference between authority exercised for the benefit of the people it is exercised over and authority exercised in their exploitation. Both use the same tools. The difference is in whose interests those tools are serving. Section 7, Vault 22, Where the Garden Became a Tomb. The Mojave Wasteland has a particular relationship with absence. 200 years of nuclear fallout and the collapse of the water management infrastructure that made the region agriculturally viable have produced a landscape that registers primarily as what is not there: color, moisture, the specific richness of soil that has been cultivated over generations. These are present only in the most managed spaces, the ones where post-war communities have invested the most in reconstruction. Everywhere else, the Mojave is dry and pale and sparse in the way that places become when the systems that sustained their complexity have been removed and nothing comparable has been built to replace them. The ambition of Vault 22 was to directly address this absence. The Vault's experimental mandate was agricultural. It had been designated and funded as a botanical research facility. tasked with developing plant strains capable of growing in post-nuclear soil conditions, strains that were resistant to elevated radiation levels, capable of producing usable food yields in environments with compromised chemistry, engineered to survive and propagate in the conditions that the bombs were expected to produce on the surface. This was, by the standards of the Vault program, a genuinely useful research mandate. Most Vault experiments were designed to produce data about human behavior or human biology in controlled conditions. Vault-22 was designed to produce food, sustainable radiation-resistant food crops that could be deployed in the post-war world and form the agricultural foundation of whatever communities rebuilt themselves from the ruins. The people who conceived this mandate were, presumably, thinking about what survivors would need in the decades after the bombs fell. They were thinking practically and, within the context of everything the Vault program was, charitably. Someone in the program cared enough about what came after to invest resources in making the aftermath more survivable. The Vault succeeded at growing things, just not the things that were supposed to grow. The botanical research conducted at Vault-22 in the facility's early operational years was legitimate and sophisticated. The Vault had been equipped with growing areas of considerable scale, multiple floors of cultivated space, environmental control systems capable of mimicking a range of climatic conditions, and the full range of scientific infrastructure that serious agricultural research requires. The research team included botanists and agronomists and genetic biologists whose pre-war credentials were genuine and whose enthusiasm for the work was apparent in the terminal entries they left behind. They were making progress. The early entries document the development of plant strains with measurably improved performance in simulated post-nuclear soil chemistry. They were solving real problems. The data they were generating would have been genuinely useful if it had ever reached the people and communities that needed it. The fungal agent that destroyed Vault-22 came from Big Mountain. Big Mountain is, in the Fallout New Vegas extended universe, a facility that represents a particular kind of pre-war scientific culture. Ambitious, brilliant, poorly overseen, and deeply irresponsible in ways that became apparent only when the consequences arrived. The research installation had been pushing the boundaries of multiple scientific disciplines simultaneously, in an environment that prioritized discovery over safety assessment and that had developed the specific institutional culture of a place where people had stopped asking whether something should be done, because the capability to do it was too exciting to slow down. Bovaria mordicana was one of Big Mountain's agricultural products. In controlled conditions and properly managed applications, it was a legitimate agricultural tool. The fungus could modify the growth behavior of plants in ways that produced significant yield improvements. It could be used to encourage root development, to improve nutrient uptake, to accelerate maturation times. Under the right conditions, with appropriate containment and oversight, it was a useful addition to the agricultural scientist's toolkit. The people at Vault-22 who received Bovaria mordicana through the research supply chain were not negligent. They were working with a compound that had been developed by a credentialed institution and distributed through official channels. They incorporated it into their research program as any careful scientist would, with protocols and controls, and the expectation that the tool's behavior would stay within the parameters they had been given. Bovaria mordicana's behavior outside its original parameters had not been fully characterized. The fungus established itself in Vault-22's growing areas and behaved as specified for a while. And then it began doing something that the original characterization had not captured. It spread through the soil, through the root systems of the plants that were being cultivated, through the organic material in the growing areas, and then through the Vault's environmental systems. The air recyclers that maintained the facility's atmospheric quality were doing exactly what they were designed to do, cycling air through the Vault's spaces to maintain oxygen levels and temperature and humidity. In doing this, they were also cycling the fungal spores that Bovaria mordicana had begun producing in volumes that no one had anticipated. The spores reached the residential areas. They reached the dining hall. They reached the corridors and the common spaces and the dormitories where the Vault's residents slept. They reached the water systems. And then they reached the residents. Bovaria mordicana's effect on human hosts was not immediate death. The fungus was not, in that sense, a weapon. It was an organism with its own reproductive logic, and that logic was served by maintaining the health and mobility of its host population for long enough to maximize spore distribution. What the fungus did, over weeks and then months of established infection, was infiltrate the nervous system. The specific mechanism involved fungal growth along neural pathways, gradually replacing the host's autonomous neural signaling with something else, a biochemical control system that the fungus used to direct the host's behavior toward activities that served spore distribution, movement, contact with other organisms and environments. The specific behaviors that spread the infection effectively. The infected residents became what the game calls spore carriers. They are still mobile. They are still physically capable. They have lost the autonomous agency that distinguishes a person making choices from an organism executing a program. What they do is what the fungus requires them to do. What they were before the infection is no longer operative. The research staff at Vault-22 documented the outbreak with the professional discipline of scientists who understood that their records might be the only thing that survived the facility's collapse. The early entries are methodical clinical descriptions of the fungal spread, observations about the mechanism of infection, attempts to characterize the progression timeline in subjects at different stages of exposure. They are scientists doing their job in an uncontrolled situation, trying to maintain the observational rigor that might produce useful information even in the middle of a disaster. The later entries are different, more fragmented, more personal. Some of them read like people who are trying to document the experience of watching everyone around them change into something they cannot recognize, including people they knew, people they had worked alongside for years, people whose pre-infection selves are still visible in the faces and bodies of the things that are now approaching down the corridor. And then the entries stop. 118 residents escaped Vault-22 before the outbreak reached a stage that made exit impossible. The mechanism of their escape is documented in the Vault's records. They identified an emergency passage, organized themselves under extreme pressure, and moved through the facility in a period when the spore carriers were concentrated in other areas and the route to the exit was briefly clear. They did not escape into the Mojave wasteland. The passage through which they fled led them into a canyon system, specifically into what would become, in the post-war world, Zion Canyon. The story of what happened to the Vault-22 survivors in Zion is told in the Honest Heart's downloadable content, though not under that framing and not completely. The Vault-22 connection to Zion's pre-war history is established through the terminal records in the base game. What developed in Zion over the 2 centuries following the survivors' arrival is told through the cultures that formed there. The Sorrows, the Dead Horses, the White Legs, the various communities that had built their identities and their traditions and their understanding of the world in the canyon's relative isolation. The survivors of the Vault became, in some sense, Zion's founding population. The knowledge they carried, botanical, pharmaceutical, organizational, became part of the foundation of what developed there. The specific character of Zion Canyon as a place of unusual ecological richness in an otherwise depleted region is connected to the research that the Vault-22 survivors brought with them, the knowledge of how to cultivate and manage plants in post-nuclear conditions that the Vault's research program had developed before the outbreak destroyed the facility. The knowledge that was produced in the Vault made it out even as the people who produced it were escaping for their lives. Vault-22, when the courier enters it in 2281, has been growing for 200 years. The plants have had 2 centuries without human management. The fungal agent has had 2 centuries without containment. The environmental systems that were designed to support human life have been thoroughly repurposed by the biology that has replaced the humans as the facility's primary occupants. The growing areas that were originally carefully managed botanical research spaces have expanded beyond every physical boundary that was supposed to contain them. Green reaches through corridors that were built for people. The spore carriers are still present, still mobile, still going through the motions of existence that the fungus requires them to go through, which is primarily the movement and contact behavior that distributes spores through the environment. 200 years of this. The original infected residents are long gone. Biological matter is not as permanent as fungal substrate, but the fungal culture has maintained itself in the environment and in whatever organic material has accumulated in the facility over 2 centuries, and the spore carriers that remain are the product of that long continuation rather than the original outbreak. There is something in the physical reality of Vault-22 that does not resolve into any single clean thematic statement. The Vault was built with genuine good intent, the intent to develop food crops for a post-nuclear world. The fungal agent that destroyed it came from a research program that was also, in its own way, aimed at something useful. The researchers who brought Beauveria mordicana into the facility were not negligent. They were careful. The outcome was catastrophic anyway. This is one of the things that the Fallout universe returns to repeatedly, in different registers and with different specifics, across all the vaults and all the stories it tells. Good intent and careful practice and genuine competence are not sufficient protection against the consequences of working with things you do not fully understand. In systems that are more complex than your model of them, at scales that exceed the parameters under which your model was developed, Beauveria mordicana, in controlled conditions, was a useful tool. Vault-22 was a controlled environment. The organisms involved had their own ideas about the boundaries of the control. The research that Vault-22's team was conducting before the outbreak is worth understanding not simply as the backdrop to a tragedy, but as a genuine scientific effort that had real potential implications for the post-war world. The problem of growing food in irradiated soil is not a minor technical challenge. After a nuclear exchange at the scale that the Fallout universe depicts, the soil chemistry of large portions of the surface is fundamentally disrupted. Radiation damages the microbial communities that make soil productive, alters its chemical composition in ways that prevent most conventional plant varieties from absorbing the nutrients they need, and produces conditions that kill or mutate the organisms that conventional agriculture depends on. The Vault's botanical research was aimed directly at this problem. The team was developing plant varieties that could establish root systems in compromised soil, absorb nutrients through modified biochemical pathways that worked in irradiated conditions, and produce food yields sufficient to sustain human communities. This is the kind of research that, if it had been able to leave the vault and reach the surface, would have had enormous practical implications for post-war survival. The irony of the outcome that the vault built to develop post-war food solutions became instead a source of a fungal outbreak that killed most of its residents and forced the survivors to flee is one of the series' most pointed examples of the gap between what the vaults were designed to accomplish and what they actually produced. The knowledge that did escape Vault-22, carried by the 118 survivors who fled into Zion Canyon, may have been more valuable than anything the vault would have produced if the experiment had proceeded as designed. The survivors brought with them 2 decades of accumulated botanical knowledge in the form of practical skill, not just data in files, but the embodied knowledge of people who had been doing agricultural research under controlled conditions and who knew, from direct experience, what worked and what did not. In Zion Canyon, that knowledge contributed to the development of one of the Mojave region's most ecologically unusual spaces, a canyon where plant life has recovered to degrees that are uncommon in the surrounding wasteland, where the water is relatively clean, where certain kinds of cultivation are possible that would not be possible on the open desert floor. Whether this outcome is directly traceable to the Vault-22 survivors is a matter of interpretation, but the connection is there, in the lore, for anyone who traces the threads. The vault that was destroyed by the thing it was studying produced survivors who took what they had learned into the world and applied it. The knowledge that the outbreak was supposed to destroy traveled out in the bodies and minds of the people who survived. Section 8. Vault 112. A God in a Basement. Every experiment in the Vault program produced data. Most of them also produced suffering that was incidental to the data, the suffering being a property of the experimental conditions rather than the experiment's stated purpose. The researchers who designed the behavioral experiments and the genetic experiments and the psychological isolation experiments were studying specific variables. The suffering that the variables produced in the people exposed to them was, in the language of research methodology, a side effect, the result of necessary conditions rather than the condition itself. Vault 112 is the exception in a specific and disturbing way. In Vault 112, the suffering was not incidental. It was the direct content of what the Vault's overseer was doing with the population in his care. The experiment had an external designation that referenced something about psychological resilience and simulated reality environments. The actual content of the experiment was whatever Stanislaus Braun wanted to do on any given day with the community of people who were asleep in pods in the vault beneath his feet, living in a simulated world that he controlled completely. Braun was, by any pre-war assessment, a scientist of genuine distinction. He invented the GECK, the Garden of Eden Creation Kit, the terraforming device that appears across the Fallout series as the most sincere representation of the program's stated intention. A tool designed to be used in the aftermath of the war to accelerate environmental recovery, to introduce viable plant and animal life into irradiated soil, to create the conditions for agriculture and habitation in places that the bombs had made inhospitable. The device that was given to most vaults as a component of their post-war mission. The device that represents, within the fiction of Fallout's universe, the genuine hope that someone had for what came after. Braun built the hope. He also built Tranquility Lane, which is not hope at all. The simulated reality technology that Braun developed before the war was a significant scientific achievement, and it is worth understanding what it actually does before understanding what Braun did with it. The Tranquility Lane system is a full sensory simulation, a computer-generated environment experienced through neural interface pods that provide complete sensory experience of a world that exists only in the system's memory, touch, temperature, smell, the physical weight of objects and the texture of surfaces, the quality of light at different times of day, all of it generated and delivered to the connected participant in a way that is, from the participant's perspective while in the simulation, functionally indistinguishable from external reality. The environment Braun chose for Vault 112 simulation was a specific idealized neighborhood, the American suburb of the 1950s, rendered in the specific form that exists as much in cultural memory as in actual geography, the version of suburban America that appeared in television programs and magazine advertisements, and the collective imagination of a nation that had decided this particular form of domestic life was what prosperity looked like. Houses with lawns and white fences, children playing in the street in the late afternoon, the particular quality of summer light in a neighborhood that believes itself to be permanent. It was beautiful in the way that designed things are beautiful, composed to produce a specific feeling, every element calibrated toward an aesthetic effect that communicated safety and ordinariness, and the sense that nothing here would ever change for the worse. The residents of Vault 112 were connected to the Tranquility Lane system. They entered the pods. They went to sleep in the physical world. They woke up in the neighborhood, with no knowledge of where their bodies actually were or how much time was passing outside the simulation. Braun had been in the simulation from the beginning. He had full administrative access. He experienced the same environment as the residents, with one difference that made all the other differences possible. He was the administrator of the simulation. He could modify it. He could introduce new elements, new actors, new events. He could change the rules of the space while others were living inside it. He had, within the simulation's parameters, something close to omnipotence. He posed as a child. The specific choice to present as a small girl named Betty is one of the details of Vault 112's story that lodges in the imagination and does not fully leave. Braun had been doing this for 200 years when the lone wanderer arrives. He had been playing the role of a cheerful, slightly unsettling child in a suburban neighborhood, watching the other residents live out whatever scenario he had set for them for longer than any living person the lone wanderer has met has been alive. The performance is ancient. The mask has been on so long that the question of what is under it has stopped being clearly meaningful. He wanders through the neighborhood. He interacts with the residents in the way that a child might interact with adults who are playing a game that he designed, with the particular quality of someone who already knows all the rules and is watching to see how the other players respond to them. What he has been doing to those residents, across the span of 2 centuries, is this. He resets the simulation, regularly. The residents live through a scenario, experience whatever outcomes the scenario produces, and then wake up at the beginning with no memory of the previous cycle. The reset wipes the experiential record. They begin again without carrying the knowledge of what just happened to them. The scenarios escalate. What begins, presumably as psychologically interesting, becomes, over time, psychologically exhausting to design. When you have been creating situations for the same small group of people for decades and have exhausted the range of their reactions to ordinary circumstances, the only direction available for sustaining your own engagement is toward more extreme content, more disturbing scenarios. Situations that push the residents to do things they would not ordinarily do, that pit them against each other, that place them in conditions of loss or violence or despair. The residents would experience these things. The reset would erase their memory of having experienced them, and then it would begin again. There is an entry in Old Lady Eves's terminal. Her name varies across different accounts of the vault story, but the woman herself is consistent that documents something important. She has been through enough resets that fragments of memory from previous cycles are beginning to persist, not clearly, not in forms that would allow her to articulate or act on what she is trying to remember. But the fragments are there, the specific residue of experiences that the wipe did not fully erase, experienced as a groundless anxiety, an unlocatable sense that something is wrong, the specific quality of a person who is trying to remember something important and cannot access the memory but cannot let go of the sense that it matters. She is living in the gap between what she knows, which is that the neighborhood is safe and pleasant, and what she feels, which is that something about all of this is very wrong. Braun knows this about her. He does not stop the resets. James, the lone wanderer's father, arrives at Vault 112 in pursuit of the Project Purity research that has consumed his adult life. He is captured by the Vault's security systems, the defense mechanisms that protect the pod room and the simulation it runs, and connected to the Tranquility Lane system. The lone wanderer follows. The first encounter with Betty in the simulated neighborhood is one of Fallout 3's most effectively designed moments. The neighborhood is genuinely pleasant looking. The light is warm. The child who greets you is cheerful in a way that is slightly, indefinably off, the offset being the gap between the surface of the performance and the 2 centuries of calculated cruelty that are operating the performance from the inside. Betty gives the lone wanderer tasks. The tasks are cruel in ways that are carefully calibrated, cruel enough to establish who Braun is and what he has been doing, but framed in the simulation's cheerful suburban aesthetic in a way that makes the cruelty feel almost abstract. The neighborhood's residents go about their business around you. They do not know that everything that is happening to them has been designed by the small girl who is watching. There are 2 ways to end the simulation. The first is to negotiate with Braun. He will release the simulation and its residents if given something sufficiently interesting, a task completed to his satisfaction, a demonstration that there is something outside the simulation worth engaging with. He is bored. 2 centuries of running the same neighborhood for the same small group of people, even with the variation that his scenarios provided, has produced the specific kind of boredom that belongs to someone who has exhausted every available stimulus and cannot locate new ones. The negotiation path produces a resolution. Braun releases the simulation. The pods open. The residents' bodies, which have been lying in those pods for 200 years, are still alive. The pod technology has maintained their biological functions throughout. But 2 centuries of neurological dependency on the simulation have left most of them unable to process the physical world as real. They stumble out into the vault's corridors and cannot fully locate themselves in space. The simulation is more coherent to their nervous systems than the reality they have returned to. They are free, in the technical sense. In the practical sense, they are not sure where they are. The second path involves a terminal hidden in the neighborhood, accessible through a series of clues that Braun's residents have preserved across the resets and fragments, the specific kind of information that finds its way into cracks in the system when the system has not quite managed to erase everything. The terminal contains a failsafe for the simulation, a scenario designated as the Chinese invasion, which, when activated, introduces android soldiers into the neighborhood with instructions to kill everyone present. The androids kill all the residents, permanently, not reset and restart. The simulation's records are closed. The neighborhood is empty. Braun cannot be killed by the androids. His administrative status protects him from the simulation's physics. He is still there when the androids are done, sitting in the empty neighborhood, in the late afternoon light, in the house with the lawn and the white fence. Alone. The game does not return to Vault 112 after this. What Braun does in the empty simulation, whether he continues to run scenarios with no one to subject them to, whether he eventually disconnects himself, whether he simply remains in the space he has occupied for 200 years and finds some form of peace or continued torment in the emptiness, is not addressed. Some things are better not resolved. Braun's situation either way has a quality that does not require elaboration. He built a world entirely subject to his will, filled it with people who could not escape it, and either those people are gone or he released them into a physical world they can no longer properly navigate. The vault continues to exist below the neighborhood. The pods are still in their rows. The technology still functions, presumably. The simulation could be run again if someone chose to run it. Whether that is a threat or simply a fact depends on what happens next. And what happens next is not Vault 112's story to tell. It belongs to whoever finds the place, reads the terminals, looks at the rows of pods and the clean, well-maintained infrastructure of a system that has been running for 200 years, and has to decide what to do with the knowledge of what it was used for. The technology that Braun built, the Tranquility Lane system, has an interesting relationship to the GECK that he also invented, and the relationship illuminates something about who Braun was before the Vault. These are the two most significant things he created, and they pull in opposite directions. The GECK is oriented outward toward the surface, toward recovery, toward the creation of conditions that would allow human communities to rebuild in the aftermath of catastrophe. It is a tool designed to give something to the world. The Tranquility Lane system is oriented inward, toward a constructed interior, toward a sealed simulation, toward a world that Braun built and controlled entirely. It is a tool designed for Braun himself. Whatever Braun's motivations were when he designed both systems, and the records do not illuminate this in any direct way, the two inventions represent a kind of double commitment. Commitment to the project of helping humanity rebuild, represented by the GECK, commitment to the project of escaping the world entirely and replacing it with something subject to his personal control, represented by Tranquility Lane. These two things coexisted in the same person. The genius that designed the post-war world's most important terraforming tool was the same genius that designed a 2-century torture device for a few hundred people who had the misfortune of ending up in his vault. This is not a contradiction that resolves easily. Most readings of human psychology resist the idea that the same person can be genuinely both of these things. The creator of something that represents sincere hope for humanity, and the operator of something that represents comprehensive disregard for individual humans. And yet the evidence in the game's records suggests that Braun was both. Perhaps the GECK was his early self's best ambition, and Tranquility Lane was what happened when the sealed vault, with its absolute authority and its absence of any external check on what he could do, provided conditions for a different self to emerge and grow unchecked across 2 centuries. People become, in some measure, what their conditions allow and what their conditions require. Braun's conditions allowed anything, and he used that allowance in the specific directions that the available evidence shows. Section 9. Vault 79 and the gold at the end of the world. 79 is the atomic number of gold? This is not a coincidence. The periodic table assigns gold its position based on the number of protons in its nucleus, 79 of them, arranged in the dense stable configuration that gives the element its defining properties. Gold does not corrode. It does not oxidize. It does not tarnish under ordinary atmospheric conditions. Place a gold object in the soil and come back in 1,000 years, and it will look essentially the same as the day it was buried. The metal's resistance to chemical reaction is so complete that virtually nothing that happens in the natural environment can degrade it. This persistence is precisely what made gold valuable in the pre-war world. The monetary system that most developed nations operated under, whether on a formal gold standard or the modified post-Bretton Woods arrangement that characterized the late 20th and early 21st centuries, was built on gold's fundamental property of refusing to change. You could store value in gold because gold reliably held its form across time and across conditions that destroyed most other things. The pre-war United States government held its gold reserves at Fort Knox, in Kentucky, as it had for over a century. Fort Knox is a United States Army installation that has served as the bullion depository since 1937, holding the physical gold that represented the material foundation of American monetary policy. Vault 79 was built beneath the Kentucky landscape, in proximity to Fort Knox, for a purpose that the Vault-Tec advertising materials did not mention in any publicly accessible document: to receive and store a significant portion of Fort Knox's gold reserves in a secure underground facility that would survive the nuclear exchange that the program's designers knew was coming. The logic was, within the framework of the people who commissioned the vault, straightforward. Gold's value derived from its persistence. Whatever world emerged from the nuclear exchange would, at some point, need to rebuild an economic infrastructure. That infrastructure would need a foundation. Gold was the traditional foundation. Preserving the United States government's gold reserves was, therefore, the preservation of one of the essential conditions for the eventual reconstitution of a functional economy, and, through it, a functional government. The people who descended into Vault 79 with the gold were not vault residents in the conventional sense. They were Secret Service agents, Treasury officials, logistics specialists, and the various support staff that a long-term secured facility would require. They had not been recruited through the Vault program's normal channels. They had been assigned. They were there because they had the security clearances and the institutional roles that made them the appropriate people to guard what was being placed in the vault. Their mission was straightforward in its statement, complex in its execution, and ultimately tragic in what its execution required of the people assigned to carry it out. Guard the gold until the United States government reconstituted itself and arrived to reclaim it. There was no specified timeline for this. There was no defined threshold that would have allowed the agents to say, with confidence, that sufficient time had passed and the government was not coming and they could stand down. There was no chain of authority external to the vault that could have issued the relevant orders, because the chain of authority external to the vault was the United States government, and the United States government had ceased to exist in the forms that had defined it. The mission was to wait for something that was not coming in any form the mission's parameters could recognize. The institutional waiting that characterized Vault 79's existence across 250 years has a quality that is specific to organizations rather than individuals. When an individual waits for something that does not arrive, the psychology of waiting has natural endpoints. People reach conclusions. They reassess their expectations. They reorganize their behavior around the revised assessment. The waiting ends, one way or another, because people have a limited tolerance for maintaining a state of expectation about something that shows no evidence of occurring. Institutions can maintain states of expectation across timescales that would be psychologically impossible for any individual member of those institutions. The waiting is distributed across multiple people and transmitted to new members as older ones age and die. No single person in Vault 79 experienced 2.5 centuries of waiting. Each generation experienced a portion of it, inherited the institutional posture of waiting from the generation before, transmitted it to the next. The total duration of the wait accumulated without any individual bearing its full weight. This can produce a specific kind of institutional drift, where the original purpose of the institution has so thoroughly lost its context that the institution is primarily serving the purpose of perpetuating itself. The agents in Vault 79 were guarding gold on behalf of a government that had not existed for over 200 years, following protocols designed for a handoff scenario that had no plausible mechanism for actually occurring, under an authority structure whose external referent had dissolved before most of the people following it were born. The gold was still there. The agents were still guarding it. The mission was still, in the institutional language of the facility, active. The United States government was not coming. The specific texture of life inside Vault 79 across those 2.5 centuries is not as thoroughly documented in the game's lore as some other vaults. The Wastelanders update for Fallout 76, released in 2020, opens the vault to the player character and introduces the factions competing for access to its contents. But the vault's internal history, the daily lives of the agents who guarded the gold, the social structures they developed, the way that the mission was transmitted across generations, is presented in fragments rather than comprehensive documentation. What emerges from those fragments is the picture of an institution that has developed, over time, a very thorough relationship with the idea of itself. The Secret Service identity, the sense of belonging to an organization with a specific mandate and a specific culture and a specific set of values, has been preserved and intensified by 2.5 centuries of isolation in a way that makes the institutional identity more real and more present than the external reality it was originally built to serve. The agents who are present in the vault when the player character arrives are operating under a worldview that has been sealed from external influence for long enough that it has become self-referential in ways its original architects would not have recognized. They are still Secret Service. They are still guarding the gold. They are still waiting for the government. The question of what it would mean for the government to arrive, what entity could present itself with the credentials and the authority and the legitimate succession that the Vault's protocols specify, is one that the agents have been living with for so long that it has become background rather than foreground. It is present, but not actively examined. The mission continues. The waiting continues. The gold continues to be exactly what it was. The competing factions in the Wastelanders update the Raiders and the Settlers each represent a different vision of what the gold could mean in the current state of the world. The Raiders' perspective is instrumental. Gold represents concentrated material value, that can be converted into power and resources and leverage in the post-war economy. The practical question of what gold is worth in a world where the monetary infrastructure that made gold meaningful has been replaced by bottle caps and barter is somewhat underexplored in their planning. But raiders are generally not the most thorough long-range planners, and this is consistent with their overall orientation. The settlers' vision is more ambitious in a reconstructive sense. They see the gold as a foundation for rebuilding something like a stable post-war economy and, eventually, a governmental structure with the kind of institutional legitimacy that the post-war world has largely lacked. This requires answering questions about how you build an economy based on precious metal in a world that has been operating on different premises for 2 centuries, and the Wastelanders storyline does not fully resolve those questions because they are genuinely hard. The Secret Service agents have their own relationship to these competing claims, shaped by 2.5 centuries of custodial identity. To surrender the gold to hand it to any entity other than a reconstituted version of the United States government would be to answer the question that no one in the facility has been willing to definitively answer: that the government is not coming, that the mission is not going to complete in the form it was specified, and that the thing they have organized their institutional existence around is a structure that no longer has an external referent. The gold is still there when the player character arrives. Whatever resolution the Wastelanders' questline reaches, the physical fact of the reserve sitting in their vault unchanged and unchangeable, exactly as permanent as gold always is, remains. 2.5 centuries after it was sealed inside, the material foundation of a government's monetary policy sits in the darkness under Kentucky, exactly as it was placed. Gold does not record time. It does not show the passage of 2 centuries the way that almost everything else does. It does not carry the marks of the world that has changed around it. It is simply there, the same as always, patient in the specific way that matter without consciousness is patient, not waiting. Exactly, because waiting implies expectation, and gold has no capacity for expectation. It simply persists, through everything, past the government that valued it and the civilization that gave it meaning, and the nuclear exchange that destroyed both. Vault 79 is unique among Vault stories in this way. Most Vault stories are about what happens to people in sealed environments over time. This one is, at its core, about what happens to an object in a sealed environment over time. The answer is nothing. The gold is unchanged. The people around it changed, enormously and across multiple generations, and built entire institutional identities around the task of maintaining something that did not need maintaining because it was not going to change regardless. The thing they guarded required no guarding. It would have been there whether they watched it or not, but they watched it anyway, for 2.5 centuries, because that was the mission. There is something almost poignant about this, if you look at it from a certain angle, and something almost absurd if you look from another, and something that is both at once, which is how the most characteristically Fallout things tend to work, the humor and the sadness operating in the same space simultaneously, neither one canceling out the other. There is a metaphysical dimension to the gold of Vault 79 that becomes more apparent the longer you sit with the story. Value, in the conventional economic sense, is not a property of objects. It is a property of the relationships between objects and the systems that organize human behavior around them. Gold was valuable in the pre-war world because a very large number of people, organized by institutional structures that had been in place for centuries, behaved in ways that treated gold as valuable. They stored it, traded it, organized their economic lives around its relative scarcity and its specific physical properties, and agreed through the accumulated behavior of millions of people across long periods of time that it was worth something. The nuclear exchange did not change gold's physical properties. It changed the systems that gave those properties meaning. The systems that organized human behavior around gold's value, the monetary institutions, the banking structures, the trading networks, the political arrangements that depended on all of these were destroyed or severely damaged by the bombs and by the social collapse that followed them. In their absence, bottle caps became the functional currency of the post-war economy. Not because bottle caps have any inherent value they do not, any more than gold does, but because a sufficient number of people in a sufficient number of places began treating them as a medium of exchange, and that treatment, sustained across enough transactions and enough time, created the system that makes them valuable. Gold, in the meantime, sat in Vault 79, exactly as permanent and exactly as unchanged as it had ever been, waiting for the systems that made it meaningful to return. Whether those systems will return, whether the post-war world will rebuild the institutional architecture that would allow gold to resume its traditional role in organizing economic life, is one of the most interesting questions in the Fallout universe's long-range political landscape. The factions that compete for control of Vault 79's reserves each have their own answer to this question, implicit in their different visions of what the gold would be used for. The Raiders' answer is essentially no. Value what can be immediately converted into power and resources, because the institutional infrastructure for a gold-based economy is not going to reconstitute itself in any time frame that matters to present-day decisions. The settlers' answer is maybe, if you build the right institutions around it, gold could anchor the kind of monetary system that might allow for the kind of stable, long-range economic planning that reconstruction requires. Both answers are responses to the same underlying question, which is, what is value? In a world where the systems that created the most familiar forms of it have been destroyed. The gold does not participate in this question. It cannot. It simply sits there, unchanged and unchangeable, as it always has and as it always will, long after everyone arguing about what it is worth has also become permanent in a different sense. Section 10. Vault 3, Vault 34, and the ones that broke open too soon. Not every vault story is a long story. Some of them are short. Some of them are the story of a door left unlocked and an opening that could not be refused, and the specific tragedy of a shelter that functioned exactly as designed right up until the moment it intersected with something its design had not accounted for. The Mojave Wasteland has several vaults. They are distributed across the region in ways that reflect the pre-war population distribution of Nevada and the surrounding areas, and they present a range of experimental types, operational histories, and fates. The ones that broke open too early, before whatever conditions the program's designers had intended, as the release threshold had been met, tell a different kind of story than the ones that ran for decades or generations. They tell the story of what happens when a controlled experiment meets the uncontrolled world at an angle it was not designed to handle. Vault 3, in the southwestern quadrant of New Vegas, is described in the available lore as a control vault, one of the facilities in the program that was designated as a genuine shelter rather than an experimental chamber, a place where residents were given reasonable resources and a functioning social structure and no particular manufactured crisis to navigate. The residents of Vault 3 had, by the lottery of the Vault program's assignment system, received one of the best possible outcomes. Their vault was supposed to be a shelter, not a laboratory, not a psychological experiment, not a genetic program or a pharmaceutical trial. A shelter. A water main broke. This is not an event that resolves into symbolic significance or narrative structure. It is simply a plumbing failure. In the context of a sealed underground facility, a broken water main is a crisis that forces a decision between several genuinely bad options. You can work to repair the break from the inside, which is possible but difficult, and may require materials and expertise that are not available within the sealed environment. You can manage the flooding as an ongoing condition, which is sustainable in the short term but increasingly untenable over time. Or you can open the door and seek outside help. Vault 3's residents voted. They chose to open the door. By the time this decision was made, the surface had been habitable for long enough that opening the vault was a rational choice in the direct physical sense. The radiation levels in the area had declined to survivable thresholds, and the world outside, while not hospitable in any comfortable sense, was navigable. People were surviving on the surface. Communities had formed. The post-war Mojave had settled into the rough and violent and often desperate configuration that it displays in 2281. The residents of Vault 3 opened their door, established contact with the outside world, and began cautiously integrating into the surface economy. They traded. They interacted with nearby settlements. They did the work of transitioning from a sealed community to a community with an open border, which is a significant organizational transition, but one that this particular vault's residents were, by most accounts, handling reasonably well. The Fiends were one of the Mojave's most dysfunctional raider groups. They were organized, to the extent that the term organizational applies, around chemical dependency, a community whose shared identity was built on substance use and the violence that accompanies it in its most unmanaged forms. They were not a political entity with goals that extended meaningfully beyond the next act of destruction or the next acquisition of the resources that supported their chemical dependency. They were simply dangerous, in the specific way that people become dangerous when they have stopped engaging with the concept of consequences. The fiends raided Vault 3. Most of the residents were killed. The vault was taken. The vault that was, by the program's design, one of the lucky ones, the control vault, the one given reasonable resources and no experimental agenda, ended with its surviving residents expelled and its space occupied by people who had no use for anything in it except its structural protection and its supply caches. There is a specific quality to this kind of loss that is different from the loss in the experimental vaults. The residents of Vault 11 lost people every year to a manufactured necessity that was a lie from the beginning. The residents of Vault 92 were destroyed by a signal they could not hear. The residents of Vault 75 were exploited by an institution that had deceived them about everything that mattered. The residents of Vault 3 did nothing wrong. They navigated their situation with reasonable judgment. They made a defensible decision at every stage. And then they encountered something that their reasonable judgment was not designed to account for, because no amount of reasonable judgment can reliably account for the specific combination of timing and misfortune and the presence of a particular group of people in a particular location at a particular moment. Life is sometimes simply lost to circumstance rather than to any specific design. This is its own kind of tragedy, perhaps a harder one to sit with than the designed kinds, because it offers no one to direct the grief toward. Vault 34's story has a different character from Vault 3's, where Vault 3's experiment was no experiment at all, just a shelter that encountered the wrong element of the surface world at the wrong moment. Vault 34 was designed with a specific and predictable, experimental logic. The vault's parameters included two conditions. The armory would be overstocked and under-restricted, and the facility would be overpopulated relative to its long-term resource planning. The first condition meant that every resident of Vault 34 had easy access to quantities of ammunition and weapons that significantly exceeded any reasonable personal defensive need. The armory was not locked down or restricted by authorization requirements. Residents could walk in and arm themselves with whatever they felt inclined to take. The vault was, in terms of lethal capability, saturated. The second condition meant that the vault's population exceeded the capacity that its resource allocation systems had been designed to support. Food, living space, water, the resources that become contentious in any closed environment, were being allocated among more people than the facility's long-term planning had accounted for. The ordinary frictions that develop in overcrowded environments were present in Vault 34 from early in its operation, and they were developing against a background of universal access to a fully stocked armory. The experimental hypothesis, presumably, was about whether social norms could develop around weapons access in a population with universal availability, whether communities develop self-regulating constraints on the use of lethal force even when the physical constraints on accessing it have been removed, or whether the availability of weapons fundamentally changes the dynamics of conflict in ways that make the development of such norms impossible. The answer, in Vault 34, was that a civil war developed. Not immediately, not in the first weeks or months, when the shock of the vault ceiling was still fresh, and the social instinct toward cooperation in a crisis was still dominant. But over time, as the overcrowding produced its inevitable accumulation of grievances and competition, and the specific resentments of people who are living in too little space with too few resources and too many reminders of what everyone around them is, taking and what is left for them over time, the weapons were used. The conflict split the vault's population into factions, not along any principled ideological lines. The lines were drawn by proximity and alliance and the momentum of events, people on one side or the other because their neighbors were on that side, because their family was there, because the sequence of events had placed them there before the distinction had fully crystallized into something with a clear meaning. People fought because the armory made fighting easy and the conditions made wanting to fight easy. The Boomers of Nellis Air Force Base are one of Fallout New Vegas's most memorable factions. They are a community defined by two things: remarkable expertise with pre-war military ordnance and a comprehensive, aggressively maintained hostility toward anyone who approaches their territory without invitation. They live at Nellis Air Force Base, northeast of New Vegas, behind a perimeter that they defend with artillery on a hair trigger, and they have been doing this for long enough that it is simply how they understand the world to work. They are the survivors of Vault 34. a group that escaped the weapons vault and built an entire culture around the weapons, around the ordnance, and the institutional knowledge of military hardware and the specific combination of pride and fear that comes from being very good at something very destructive. Their hostility to outsiders is not irrational in light of their history. It is the behavioral expression of a community that has made a specific assessment of the outside world based on the evidence available to them and has organized its entire security doctrine around the conclusion that sufficient capability to destroy approaching threats is the most reliable form of protection. Whether that conclusion is correct is something the game leaves to the player to assess. The boomers are not presented as villains. They are presented as a community with a specific history that has produced a specific set of responses to the world, responses that are comprehensible in light of that history, even when they create problems for people trying to interact with them. Across the Mojave, there are other vaults whose doors open too early or in the wrong direction or at the wrong moment. Each of them adds a different element to the picture of what the Vault program actually produced, as opposed to what it was designed to produce. The vaults that broke open too soon are, in some sense, the clearest evidence that the program's designers did not fully control their own experiment. They built sealed environments and specified parameters and wrote instructions for overseers and designed the conditions they wanted to observe. And then the physical world, with its broken water mains and its raider groups and its specific combination of factors that no design process fully accounts for, intervened. The experiment encountered reality. Reality did not follow the experimental protocol. What survived those encounters, the communities and cultures and specific human adaptations that emerged from the vaults that broke open early, are among the most diverse elements of the post-war world. The boomers with their artillery, the survivors of Vault 3, scattered across the Mojave, carrying whatever skills and experiences and specific damage their time in the vault and its aftermath had produced. Communities built from wreckage that was not supposed to produce communities yet, by people who were not supposed to be navigating the surface world on the timeline they ended up on. They navigated it anyway. The Vault program designed conditions. People found ways to survive them that the program did not predict. And then those people went out into the world and built things, sometimes good things, sometimes catastrophic things, sometimes things with the specific mixture of both that characterizes most of what human beings build when they are working with the materials available to them and trying to make something last. This is, in the end, what the vaults that broke open too soon have to teach, that controlled experiments encounter uncontrolled worlds, and the encounter does not favor the experiment. The program's designers built systems of remarkable sophistication and then sealed them and walked away, confident that the variables had been accounted for. The variables that were not accounted for: the broken water main, the raider group, the specific combination of overcrowding and universal weapons access, and the specific individuals who happened to be present when the threshold was crossed, were not random. They were simply the world, in its normal operation, producing events that the program's designers had not modeled because the program's designers were modeling human beings, not the full complexity of the physical and social environment that human beings occupy. Every sealed system eventually encounters what it sealed itself against. The question is only what form that encounter takes and what the system has built that can survive it. Section 11. Vault 101. The vault that was never going to open. Every vault had a purpose. The purposes varied enormously in their specifics: the behavioral experiments, the biological programs, the pharmaceutical trials, the social architecture studies, the containment and psychological resilience programs. Each experiment had a variable and a hypothesis and a set of designed conditions intended to generate data about that variable. Vault 101's experimental variable was simpler than most and more totalizing than any. The vault was never going to open. Not after 10 years, not after 50, not after 2 centuries, not when the radiation cleared, not when the government reconstituted itself, not when some external authority determined that the time had come to release the population back into the world. The vault's design specification was absolute and permanent containment of its resident population. No release condition, no end date, no completion threshold after which the experiment would conclude and the doors would unlock. The experiment was not studying any specific variable in the resident's behavior, in the way that the other vaults studied social dynamics or genetic outcomes or psychological response to specific stressors. It was studying a more fundamental question: whether a human community could be indefinitely maintained in a state of complete sealed isolation. Whether the social structures and psychological frameworks required for that maintenance could sustain themselves across generations without the organizing principle of an external world to eventually return to. Most vaults asked, how do people respond to specific conditions in a sealed environment? Vault 101 asked, can a sealed environment sustain a community permanently, with no exit, no external reference, no future other than continued containment? The overseer position in Vault 101 carried a burden that went beyond the usual administrative weight of vault leadership. The overseer had to maintain not just the social order and the physical systems of the facility, but the belief system that made permanent containment psychologically survivable. And the specific belief system required was, from the first day, a lie. The residents of Vault 101 were taught through education, through the overseer's authority, through the cultural transmission that all closed communities engage in as they reproduce their norms across generations, that the outside world was uninhabitable, not temporarily pending recovery, permanently and completely beyond the possibility of human survival. The bombs had not simply devastated the surface, they had rendered it permanently incompatible with human life. The vault was not a shelter pending recovery. The vault was the only world that remained. This was not entirely a lie. The capital wasteland is a genuine and serious environmental hazard, and 210 years after the bombs fell, it still presents conditions that are actively hostile to unprepared people. Super mutants roam the ruins of Washington. Raiders control significant stretches of territory. Radiation levels in certain areas remain dangerously high. Dangerous factions compete for resources in ways that make the region genuinely dangerous for the inexperienced. But people were surviving in it. Rivet City existed. Megaton existed. The settlements and communities and traveling merchants and followers and every other human presence in the capital wasteland were the evidence that survival was possible, not comfortable, not safe in any reliable sense, but possible. The surface was not what the residents of Vault 101 had been taught it was. Maintaining the lie required active maintenance. The vault's communication systems had to be managed to prevent any signal from the outside world that would contradict the established narrative. Any radio broadcast, any communication, any evidence of ongoing surface activity that penetrated the vault's information environment would have been a crack in the containment. The overseer's responsibility extended to information control in ways that most administrative roles do not. The overseer's records, preserved in the vault's terminals and available to the player, document this responsibility with a quality that changes over the generations. The early overseers described the information control as a necessary protective measure or decision made in the best interests of the community to prevent the panic and destabilization that accurate information about the surface might produce in a population that has no way to act on it and no framework for processing it constructively. The lie is framed as care. As responsible administration, later overseers describe it differently. The language shifts in ways that suggest the toll of carrying the secret across the years has produced a relationship to the deception that is more complicated than simple protective care. Some entries read as rationalization, the specific quality of someone who is working to maintain their own conviction about something they are not entirely sure about. Others read as exhaustion, the weight of maintaining a false narrative in a small community, where the truth's penetration would mean the discovery of the overseer's specific role in sustaining it, is not light. The overseer who is in position when the events of Fallout 3 begin, the one who responds to James's departure with immediate lockdown and aggressive suppression, is the endpoint of a long institutional line of people who have been keeping a secret while administering a community and who have, generation by generation, used the authority of the overseer position to maintain the conditions the experiment required. He is not, by any reading of the available evidence, a good person. He is a person who has inherited an institutional role with terrible demands and who has chosen, at every decision point, to prioritize the maintenance of his authority and the experiment's parameters over the well-being of the people in his charge. Whether earlier overseers would have made different choices in his position is not a question the game resolves. The line between individual moral failure and institutional pressure that makes moral failure nearly inevitable is one that the Vault program drew through almost every overseer's story. James arrived in Vault 101 under circumstances that the game does not fully detail in its opening exposition. He had the skills and the credentials that made him useful in the Vault's medical bay, and he had, when he arrived, A pregnant partner named Catherine, whose death in childbirth was the lone wanderer's origin point. He stayed for years. He raised the lone wanderer. He built a life in the vault in the specific way that people build lives in the conditions they inhabit, even when those conditions are not the ones they would have chosen. But James had a project. Project Purity, an effort to clean the Potomac River and provide clean water to the capital wasteland at a scale that would fundamentally change the region's survival landscape. It was ambitious in the way that things are ambitious when the person pursuing them has thought about nothing else for a very long time. It required resources and access that the vault could not provide. It required being outside the vault. He left in the night, without announcing his departure, without involving the overseer in the decision. He simply walked out through a door that the vault systems allowed him to exit, because the vault's locking protocols were designed to prevent residents from leaving as a group, and a single person with sufficient institutional access could, under the right conditions, walk out. The vault's experiment was specified as permanent containment of the resident population. James's departure was the experiment's first crack. Not because his leaving was, by itself, catastrophic to the experiment's integrity. The vault could maintain its information control and its social structure with one member absent. But because of what happened next, the lone wanderer went looking for him. The lone wanderer's emergence from Vault 101 is one of the Fallout series' most carefully constructed player experiences. The sequence of the opening, the birth in the medical bay, the childhood in the vault, the growing up in the specific texture of life in that community is designed to establish the vault as the entire world before the door opens. The player has been given enough time in the vault to understand it as complete, as sufficient, as the full scope of what exists. And then the door opens. The light is different outside. The air has a quality that sealed spaces do not. The immediate environment outside Vault 101 is Springvale, the ruins of a small suburban community, 2 centuries abandoned, its streets full of radiation, and the specific kind of ruined suburb quiet that feels like walking through the aftermath of something you arrived at too late to understand. The lone wanderer does not know what they are looking at. They were raised in a vault that told them the surface was completely uninhabitable. What they are encountering, standing in the ruins of Springvale, is the evidence that the world is present and complex and full of things they have no framework for yet. The journey that follows through the capital wasteland, toward James, toward Project Purity, toward whatever resolution the player constructs from the available choices, is the journey of someone who grew up in a world designed to never release them and who left it anyway. The specific gaps in the lone wanderer's knowledge, the skills they have and the skills they lack, the social and emotional dimensions of their experience that have never been exposed to the full complexity of a world beyond the vault. All of this is the product of the experiment that was run on them without their knowledge or consent. They are the outcome of Vault 101's program. And they are, simultaneously, the thing that ended the program by going through the door. The Vault's experiment was designed to run indefinitely. It did not. It was opened because a father made a decision that his adult conscience required him to make, and a child made a decision that their love for that father required them to make. And the intersection of those two decisions was something that 200 years of institutional information control and overseer authority had not managed to make impossible. The experiment accounted for many variables. It did not fully account for the specific weight that a person's need to find someone they love places on every other consideration the person is supposed to be balancing against it. The door is open, has been open since 2777 in the game's timeline. What the Vault's community does with an open door, after 200 years of believing that the open door was the one thing that would end them, is one of the questions that the game's Broken Steel DLC gestures toward without fully resolving. But the experiment is over. The lone wanderer who was never supposed to exist outside the vault, who was produced by circumstances that the program's designers could not have anticipated and might not have permitted if they had, is standing in the light of a world they were never supposed to see. Somewhere behind them, the vault door is open. That is the end of the experiment, and the beginning of everything else. The vault that was never supposed to open has, by 2287, been open for approximately a decade. What happens to a community that has organized its entire psychological and social architecture around the premise of permanent closure when that closure ends? This is one of the most interesting questions that the Vault 101 story raises, and the game does not fully answer. The residents who had lived their entire lives believing that the surface was permanently uninhabitable have now, in the aftermath of the lone wanderer's exit, been exposed to the information that this was not true. The specific form in which that information arrived through the chaos of the overseer's lockdown response, through the violence that the attempt to suppress the information produced, through the exodus of residents who followed the lone wanderer out and then returned with testimony about what the surface actually was not the gentle, organized revision of a false belief that any good communicator would have designed. It was a rupture, sudden, violent, and accompanied by the specific kind of institutional betrayal that is hardest to process. The discovery that the authority you trusted to protect you was protecting a lie instead. The broken steel downloadable content suggests that some Vault 101 residents chose to leave after the vault opened, and that others stayed. Those who left carried their vault upbringing into the capital wasteland, their specific skills and gaps, and the particular stamp of a childhood spent in a community that believed it was the last community on Earth. Those who stayed had to figure out what the vault meant now that its foundational premise had been exposed as false. What you tell yourself about the place you come from, when the story you were told about it turns out to have been wrong. This is not a small thing to figure out. It is the work of years, sometimes of a lifetime. The people of Vault 101 were not the only Vault survivors who had to do this work, but the specific form their version of it took was perhaps the most total. They had been told not simply that conditions outside were dangerous, which was true, but that conditions outside were impossible, which was false. The lie was not a matter of degree, but of category. The vault that opened is not the same as the vault that was sealed. Nothing that opened it could have left it the same. The question of what it became, in the years after the lone wanderer walked out into the light of Springvale, whether it rebuilt towards something genuinely new, or whether it collapsed, or whether it found some compromise between its old identity and its new circumstances, is a question the game leaves open. Open doors are like that. Section 12. The theory behind all of it, what Vault-Tec was really building. If you step back from the individual Vault stories from Vault 11's annual sacrifice, and Vault 87's viral transformation, and Vault 92's acoustic conditioning, and the rest of them, and try to see the shape of the whole program from a distance, something becomes visible that is not apparent from inside any single Vault's history. The experiments are not random. They are not the accumulated curiosity of individual researchers pursuing unrelated lines of inquiry. They are not the product of different program departments working in parallel on whatever happened to interest them that season. When you map the experiments against each other, the behavioral studies, the biological programs, the psychological containment experiments, the social architecture designs, they resolve into something that looks less like a collection of separate studies and more like a systematic investigation of a single large question, approached from many different angles by many different methods. What does it take to keep human beings alive, functional, and manageable in a sealed environment over an indefinite period? Not a decade, not 50 years, indefinitely. That is the question that every Vault experiment, viewed from sufficient distance, is a partial answer to. Tim Kaine, one of the original designers of the Fallout universe, has spoken about the intended grand narrative underlying the Vault program. In his conception, the Vaults were not simply experiments. They were prototypes for something larger. The specific technology being prototyped was a generation ship. A generation ship is a theoretical vehicle for interstellar travel, a sealed vessel capable of sustaining a human population across the centuries or millennia that would be required to travel to another star system. The engineering challenges of such a vessel are enormous in every dimension: structural, biological, agricultural, social, and psychological. But among the most significant challenges, and the one that the physical sciences alone cannot address, is the question of the human interior of such a vessel. How do you structure authority in a community that will never know any other home? How do you manage resources across generations in a closed system where nothing from outside can supplement what is available from within? What social arrangements prevent the kind of breakdown that would make multi-century isolation unsustainable? What are the limits of human psychological tolerance for a sealed environment? What happens to governance when there is no external accountability, no possibility of appealing to any authority outside the vessel, no mechanism for replacing leadership that has become abusive, no option of simply leaving? These are not abstract questions. They are precisely the questions that the Vault program was generating data about, in a systematic way, across over 100 experimental facilities. The behavioral experiments asked how populations respond to specific manufactured stressors. The biological experiments asked what the human body can be modified to endure. The isolation experiments asked what a community requires to maintain itself across generations in the absence of external contact. The experiments that deliberately generated conflicts asked how communities manage violence and resource competition in closed systems. Every experiment, from this angle, was a contribution to a body of knowledge that would be required to design a vessel capable of carrying humanity to the stars. The cruelty of the experiments was not incidental to their usefulness. The most important data came from the experiments that pushed hardest against human tolerance. Vault 11's data about manufactured necessity and moral reasoning. Vault 92's data about the limits of acoustic manipulation on a general population. Vault 75's data about what happens when the fundamental social institution of family is removed from childhood development and replaced with institutional control. These experiments produced suffering. They produced that suffering because the questions they were answering required it. The data was more valuable from the program's perspective precisely because the conditions were more extreme. This is what makes the Vault program, viewed in this light, something darker than simple cruelty. Cruelty for its own sake is disturbing but comprehensible. Cruelty as a systematic research methodology. Cruelty organized and executed in the service of a coherent long-range plan, this is something that requires a different framework to process. The people who designed the Vault program were not sadists, they were planners. They had decided that the knowledge required for their plan could only be obtained through methods that required causing serious and sustained harm to large numbers of people, and they had decided that the plan was worth the cost. They had decided, essentially, that some people were means rather than ends. The Enclave's role in the Vault program is the second layer of the program's actual architecture. The Enclave was not simply a monitoring organization. It was the intended beneficiary of the program's output, the entity that would survive the nuclear exchange in comfort, collect the data from the Vault experiments, and use that data to reconstitute something that could call itself the United States government in the post-war world. The Vault residents were not the intended heirs of the program, they were its raw material. The intended heirs were the Enclave itself, the people who had arranged for their own survival outside the Vault system, in offshore facilities and military installations, and the various secure locations that the program's architects had provided for themselves. What the Vault program was building, from the Enclave's perspective, was the knowledge base required to successfully manage a rebuilt human civilization in the post-war world. How to maintain populations in controlled conditions. What mechanisms of authority are effective in closed communities? What kinds of social manipulation work reliably at scale? What the human body can be modified to endure, and how quickly and efficiently such modification can be achieved. The Enclave intended to use this knowledge to govern whatever emerged from the war, to be the administrators of the rebuilt world, with a comprehensive understanding of how to maintain populations in ways that serve the administrators' goals. This is the context in which the Enclave's post-war operations, their FEV purification project in Fallout 3, their claims to governmental legitimacy in Fallout 2 become fully coherent. They were not simply a power-hungry faction claiming authority they had no right to. They were an organization that had invested 2 centuries in preparing for exactly this role, and that believed, with the specific conviction of people who have been planning something for a very long time, that they were the appropriate heirs to the world. Whether they were right about this is a question that the game series answers through its plots and its player choices. The answer, in narrative terms, is clearly no. But understanding why the Enclave believed what they believed, understanding the logic of their position, is necessary for understanding the Vault program as a complete system, rather than as a collection of individual atrocities. The Fallout television series added one more dimension to this picture that the games had suggested, but not fully articulated. In the show, a sequence involving recovered memories from Vault-Tec's executive leadership reveals a meeting in which the corporation's senior figures advocated for launching the nuclear exchange preemptively for striking. First, before other nations could develop comparable survival infrastructure, in order to maximize the advantage that Vault-Tec's preparations had created. The logic presented in this meeting is coldly rational within its own framework. The vaults were ready. The Enclave's offshore survival positions were secured. The research programs were underway. The longer the war was avoided, the more time other nations and other groups had to develop their own approaches to surviving it. The first mover advantage of a preemptive strike, the certainty of being the only entity with a fully prepared survival infrastructure when the exchange occurred was, from this perspective, simply strategic necessity. Whether this version of events is canonical to the game series is a question that Bethesda has left open, maintaining a certain ambiguity about the origins of the exchange that allows the games and the show to coexist without requiring one to override the other. But the show's version of events makes explicit something that the games kept implicit: the possibility that the people who built the vaults were not responding to a catastrophe they could not prevent, but engineering one they needed to happen. If that is true, then every vault story carries a different weight. Not the tragedy of things that went wrong and could not be stopped. The deliberate construction of a catastrophe to create the conditions under which a specific set of people could achieve a specific set of goals. The residents who descended into the vaults believing they were being saved from something unavoidable were, in that version of events, descending into a facility built by the people who had decided that the unavoidable thing should happen on a specific timeline that suited their planning. There is no clean way to end a story like this. The Vault program produced data. It produced survivors who carried that data in their bodies and their memories, and the specific shapes of their trauma and their resilience, and the communities they built from what remained after the doors opened. It produced genuinely monstrous outcomes, alongside genuinely human ones. It produced monsters, in some cases literally. It also produced individuals who were more than their circumstances, people who found ways to act with integrity or love or decency or simple dignity inside systems designed to make those things very difficult. What it ultimately produced was the world of Fallout. The specific texture of the post-war landscape, the factions and the politics and the ruins and the communities and the scars is shaped in ways that are not always obvious but run deeper than the surface by 2 centuries of sealed experiments and their survivors. The lone wanderer emerged from Vault 101 into a world they were never supposed to know, carrying the Vault's specific stamp on who they were. The courier navigated the Mojave through the aftermath of experiments whose data had long since been transmitted to whoever was receiving it, piecing together history from terminals and ruins. The sole survivor woke from cryosleep 210 years out of time and tried to understand what had happened to the world while they were gone. Each of them is, in a specific sense, a product of the program. The world they navigate is the world the program made. The choices they face are, in many cases, the downstream consequences of decisions made in sealed rooms 2 centuries before they were born. And here, at the end of all these stories, is the thing worth holding on to. Every vault was designed by people who believed they understood what human beings were, what we needed, what we could endure, what we were capable of, and what we were not. They built their experiments around those beliefs. They ran their programs based on their assessments. And then the people inside the vaults surprised them. Not always in good ways, sometimes in terrible ways, but in ways that the program had not fully predicted, because the program had not fully understood what it was working with. The lone wanderer went looking for their father. The 5 survivors of Vault 11 refused. The overseer of Vault 81 looked at her instructions and decided they were wrong. Curie maintained her research for 2 centuries in a sealed room, and then asked, with perfect reasonableness, to feel the sun. The program designed conditions. People found ways to be more than the conditions. That is not a moral about human resilience or the triumph of the human spirit. Those are phrases too clean for what these stories actually show. It is simply an observation about the limits of what any program, however comprehensive, can predict about the people inside it. The architects of the Vault program thought they were studying human nature. What they were actually doing was creating conditions in which human nature revealed dimensions of itself that could not be cataloged in advance. Some of those dimensions were dark, some were luminous. Most were both, in the specific, complicated mixture that characterizes most things that are genuinely human rather than designed. If you have made it to the end of all of this, if the slow accumulation of these stories has carried you somewhere quieter than where you began, then thank you for staying with it. These are not light stories. They are not supposed to be. But there is, I think, something to be gained from sitting with difficult things in a calm way. From letting the history of even fictional vaults accumulate slowly, from following the threads of what people did and why and what they became because of it, from arriving at the end of someone else's long story, having understood it a little more than you did at the beginning. You are not in a vault. The door behind you is open. The world outside is complicated and imperfect, and sometimes genuinely dangerous, and also full of the specific ordinary richness that the people in these stories spent their lives sealed away from. That is worth something. Most of the time, it is worth quite a lot. If this was useful, or restful, or both alike helps more than you might think, and subscribing means you will find the next one when it arrives. Sleep well. The people in these stories are fictional. The questions they raise are not. What does it take to maintain a false belief when the evidence against it is accumulating? Vault 11's residents answered this: 75 years and the reduction of the population to 5 people. How does an institution sustain a deception about its own nature? Vault 101's overseers answered this: generation by generation, with the specific maintenance of information control, until a single person's departure broke the architecture that the deception was built on. What happens when a person is given absolute authority over other people with no external accountability? Vault 112's Braun answered this: the answer depends on who that person is, and what they do when they discover the full weight of what they have been given. These answers are drawn from a fictional universe. They are also drawn from structures of human psychology and sociology that are real, that the game's designers were drawing on when they designed these stories, and that continue to operate in the world outside any game. This is what good science fiction does. It builds a space at sufficient remove from the present to allow certain questions to be asked without triggering the defenses that real-world proximity produces. And then it populates that space with people who are recognizably people who love and fear and make terrible choices and surprising ones, who are trapped by circumstances, and who sometimes transcend them, and it asks its questions through those people's stories. The vaults are the mechanism. The questions are the content. And the questions are worth asking, again and again, in whatever form allows them to be heard.